Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Come in from wherever you have been today and let the door close softly behind you. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing here that asks anything of you. Just a low fire, a little lamplight, and a long, slow story waiting on the workbench. Tonight we begin with a small and gentle question. Could you have kept an apothecary's shop in the 13th century? Not the storybook version, with its bubbling green smoke and its crooked wizard behind the counter, but the real one. The quiet shop of dried herbs and careful scales, of Latin names learned by candlelight, and a guild oath sworn before witnesses, of the sick and the poor waiting at the door before the sun is properly up. You might think it sounds peaceful, and in its own way it was. But it was also a trade that took the better part of a lifetime to learn properly, and a single wrong measure could undo a household in an afternoon. The old apothecary did not rush and did not guess. Everything about the life was built around patience, around the slow accumulation of small, careful habits, and we are going to walk through a single one of those long, careful days together, from the hour before dawn to the last candle put out at night. Before we settle in, if a slow evening like this is the kind of company you enjoy, you are welcome to stay close by subscribing, though only if it is genuinely useful to you. There is no need to do anything more than that tonight. Now, dim the lights if you have not already. Let the room go soft and unfocused at the edges, and let us ease gently into the day. Somewhere in a market town of the 13th century, in the hour before the bells ring for morning prayer, you are about to wake as an apothecary's journeyman, and the whole long day is waiting quietly for you. You would find the bed narrow and the room above the shop colder than you expected, the kind of cold that has settled into the plaster overnight and will not leave until the hearth below has been burning an hour or more. You would lie still for a moment, listening. Somewhere below you the shop waits in the dark, its shelves of jars and bundled herbs holding their silence the way they have held it every night for years. And somewhere further off a dog barks, once at nothing and falls quiet again. This, you would realize slowly, is not a life you have simply wandered into. It is a life you were given, apprenticed into as a boy or a girl of perhaps 12 or 13, bound by a written indenture to a master for 7 long years, and only now, well into your 20s, standing at last on the near side of qualifying. You would feel, even half asleep, the particular weight of that. Not the weight of dread, but the plain, settled weight of a thing that has been earned slowly and is not yet finished being earned. You would swing your legs down onto the cold boards and reach for your clothes in the dark by memory rather than sight. The wool tunic, the apron that still smells faintly of yesterday's crushed rosemary no matter how many times it has been brushed clean. You would find your fingers, before you are even properly awake, already moving through the small motions of the trade, testing a pinch of something left on the sill from the evening before, rubbing it between thumb and forefinger out of pure habit, the years having taught your hands to notice things your mind has not yet caught up to. The truth of a morning like this one is that it asks very little of you and everything of you at once. Little, because the actual list of tasks before the shop opens is short and familiar. Everything, because each of those small tasks, done wrong, could undo a stranger's health by nightfall. That is the peculiar shape of the apothecary's calling, and it is where we will spend the whole of tonight's slow hour together, moving from the guild oath that first admitted you to this trade. Through the opening of the shutters and the tending of the garden, the weighing of the simples and the grinding of the mortar, out into the market at midday, and back again to the sick at the door, and at last to the closing of the shop by candlelight, when the ledger is balanced and the fire is banked low for the night. Settle in now. There is nowhere to be but here, in the cold hour before a medieval dawn, remembering as you dress in the dark exactly how you came to be standing in this room at all. The memory comes to you slowly, the way memories do in the half-dark, before a fire is lit, and it begins, as it always does, with the oath. You would remember the guild hall on the day you were finally admitted as a full member of the trade, a low stone room warmed by too few candles and too many bodies. The senior apothecaries of the town seated along a bench at the far end in their good gowns, watching you with the particular patience of men and women who had once stood exactly where you were standing. You would remember the smell of the room, beeswax and old parchment, and, faintly, dried angelica root from someone's satchel, and the way your own hands had trembled slightly as you laid them on the guild's book. You would remember being told, plainly and without ceremony, that the oath you were about to swear was not a formality. It was the entire reason the guild existed at all. You would find, if you had asked any senior member why the training took so long, that the answer never changed. 7 years, sometimes 8, bound to a master by a written indenture that named your obligations in exact and unforgiving language. You would live in your master's house. You would keep his hours, which were long. You would not marry without his permission, and you would not set up your own shop, however skilled you believed yourself to have become, until the guild itself had examined you and agreed you were ready. This was not cruelty. It was the plain recognition that a person who did not yet know the difference between two similar-looking roots was a danger to every household that walked through the door, and the guild's entire purpose was to make certain that danger never reached a customer's door in the first place. The truth is that a young apprentice in the first year of training was given almost nothing to do with the actual remedies. You would sweep. You would carry water. You would learn to keep the fire at the right heat for hours at a stretch, feeding it with exactly the right amount of fuel, because so much of the apothecary's work depended on steady, unhurried heat. You would be sent to fetch and to carry, to grind the coarsest and least dangerous of the simples under close supervision, and you would spend long winter evenings simply naming things, holding a dried leaf up to a rushlight and being asked again and again what it was, where it grew, what it was good for, and what it would do to a person if it were mistaken for something else entirely. By today's standards, this would seem an almost absurdly slow way to learn a trade. You'd find yourself, in your 2nd or 3rd year, still mostly watching, still mostly listening, while your master ground and weighed and measured in front of you, narrating his own hands as he worked, the way a person teaches something they have done so many thousands of times that the doing of it has become almost a form of speech. Imagine standing at his elbow through an entire long afternoon, watching the same few motions repeated with slightly different herbs, slightly different weights, slightly different water, and slowly, without ever quite noticing the moment it happened, beginning to understand why each small difference mattered. The guild's rules, when you finally read them properly as a senior apprentice, were more detailed than you had expected. There were rules about where herbs could be gathered and at what season, because a root pulled too early or too late in the year carried a different strength entirely. There were rules about how simples were to be stored, away from damp, away from direct sun, labeled clearly in a hand any other member of the guild could read, because a shop's whole reputation could be undone by a mislabeled jar. There were rules, most seriously of all, about the handling of the strong and dangerous plants, the ones kept behind the iron grate at the back of every proper apothecary's shop, dispensed only by a senior member of the guild, and never, under any circumstance, left within reach of an unsupervised hand. You would come to understand, somewhere around your 5th year, that the guild's insistence on this long, slow apprenticeship was not really about herbs at all, not in the end. It was about temperament. It was about training a person over the better part of a decade, out of haste. The world outside the shop moved at its own hurried pace, full of urgent requests and frightened faces at the door, and the guild's whole design was to build, underneath all of that pressure, a set of hands and a mind that would not be rushed into carelessness. A midwife might send her boy running for a remedy with tears in his eyes, certain that every moment mattered, and the apothecary's task, drilled into you across 7 long years, was to move at exactly the pace the work required, and no faster, however desperate the knock at the door. The day of the oath itself, when it finally came, was almost gentle by comparison to everything that had led to it. You would remember laying your hand flat on the guild's book, its pages soft and dark with age, and repeating the words after the guild master, promising to weigh true, to sell no herb you did not know by name and by nature, to keep no false measure, to turn away no honest custom of the poor, and to guard the dangerous simples as carefully as you would guard a sleeping child. You would remember your voice sounding strange to your own ears, steadier than you felt. You would remember, afterward, being given your own small set of brass weights, wrapped in cloth, the first tool of the trade that belonged entirely to you and not to your master, and the odd, quiet pride of carrying them home through the evening streets, heavier in your pocket than their size alone would suggest. There is a particular seriousness the old apothecary carried, and it began exactly there, at the guild hall, on the day the oath was sworn. Not fear and not grimness, but a kind of settled attentiveness, the same quiet care a bridge builder might carry, or a keeper of a lighthouse. You were not simply selling herbs. You were the one careful hinge between the wild plants of the field and wood and the frightened, hopeful people who came to your door believing, correctly, that you knew something they did not. That belief was the whole foundation of the trade, and the guild had spent 7 years making certain it was deserved. You would think of all this, standing now in the cold dark of the room, above the shop, dressing slowly by memory. The brass weights themselves somewhere below on the workbench, where you had left them the evening before, wrapped in the same soft cloth, waiting as they waited every morning for the day's first careful task. Let us turn now to the shop itself and to the small, unhurried ritual of opening it. You would come down the narrow stair into the shop, while it was still nearly dark, feeling your way past the workbench you knew by touch better than by sight. And the first thing you would do, every single morning without exception, was tend the fire. A coal or two would still be glowing under yesterday's ash, if the evening's banking had been done properly, and you would coax it gently back to life with dry kindling kept always in the same dry corner, blowing softly until the small flame caught and steadied. Only once the fire was drawing well would you allow yourself to move on to the next task, because a cold shop meant cold hands, and cold hands, you had learned long ago, made clumsy, uncertain work of anything requiring precision. The shutters came next. You would find the great oak bar across the front window heavier each winter, or perhaps it only felt that way in the particular stiffness of a body not yet fully woken, and you would lift it free and set it against the wall in its usual place. Then swing the two shutters outward on their iron hinges, letting in whatever grey light the sky had to offer at that hour. In summer this light would already carry a little warmth and the first bird song from the eaves. In winter it would be barely light at all, a pale suggestion of morning rather than morning itself, and you would work by lamp a good while longer. The smell of the shop is the thing you would notice most every single morning before you noticed anything else. It is not a smell easily described to someone who has never stood in a room like that one. Dried thyme and rosemary hung in bundles from the beams overhead, releasing their scent slowly into the air of the room, the way a held breath releases slowly when finally let go. Beeswax from the polished counter, the faint sharp note of vinegar from a jar not quite stoppered tightly enough the evening before. Dust, too, an old, settled kind of dust that lived in the corners and along the tops of the highest shelves. The dust of a room that had been doing exactly this same quiet work for generations before you arrived, and would very likely go on doing it for generations after you were gone. You would breathe it all in, without quite meaning to, the way a person breathes in the smell of their own childhood home, without noticing they are doing it, and something in your shoulders would settle, the last of the sleep finally leaving your body. You would move next to the shelves, walking the length of the shop slowly, checking each row of jars in the growing light. This was not idle wandering. It was a habit drilled into you in your earliest years of apprenticeship. The daily walk past every simple in the shop, checking for damp that had crept into a lidded jar overnight, for a label gone faint enough to need rewriting before it became unreadable, for the small telltale signs of insects in a bundle of dried leaves that would otherwise ruin an entire winter's store. You would find on most mornings nothing at all out of place, and there was a quiet satisfaction in that too. The satisfaction of a room that had been cared for properly continuing to reward that care by simply being, morning after morning, exactly as it should be. The counter itself, a long slab of dark oak worn pale and smooth in the center from decades of hands and coins and small parcels sliding across it, would need wiping down. And you would do this with a cloth kept for that purpose alone, never the cloth used for the mortar, never the cloth used for the scales. Everything in the shop, you had learned, had its own cloth, its own shelf, its own precise place, and the longer you worked there, the more you came to understand that this obsessive orderliness was not fussiness for its own sake. It was the only reliable defense against the single greatest danger of the trade, which was not poison exactly, but confusion. A jar returned to the wrong shelf, a cloth used for two different purposes and never properly cleaned between them. A moment's carelessness compounding, quietly and invisibly, into a mistake that might not surface for weeks. You would light the second lamp then, the one kept on the workbench itself, rather than the counter, because the workbench was where the real labor of the day would happen, and it demanded its own steady light regardless of what the window offered. You would check the oil was sufficient to last the morning, trim the wick if it had grown too long and smoky the evening before, and set beside it, in their accustomed places, the tools you would need before the first customer of the day arrived. The mortar, cleaned and dried from the evening before. The set of brass weights, wrapped still in their soft cloth. The balance itself, its two small pans hanging motionless and level from the crossbar, exactly as it had been left, because a balance left untended could drift ever so slightly out of true, and a shop that could not trust its own scales had no business calling itself a shop at all. There is something in this slow procession of small tasks, the fire, the shutters, the shelves, the counter, the lamp, the tools laid ready, that you would come to think of, in later years, as a kind of quiet prayer performed with the hands rather than the mouth. Not because you were an especially devout person, though most apothecaries of the age were, in their own unhurried way, but because the repetition itself had a settling effect, morning after morning, year after year, that felt very much like the steadying a person gets from any practice done with full attention and no haste. By the time the shutters were fully open and the shop stood ready, you would feel entirely yourself again, the last traces of sleep gone, your hands warm and sure, the whole quiet machinery of the day's work laid out before you exactly as it should be. Outside, the town would be waking too. You would hear, faintly through the open window, the first cart wheels on the cobbles, a door somewhere being unbarred, a rooster complaining about the hour from a yard 3 streets over. But inside the shop, for these last few minutes before the world properly arrived at your door, there was only the fire settling into its steady burn, the smell of dried herbs warming slightly in the growing light, and the particular, unhurried piece of a room prepared with care. There was, however, one more task before the shop could truly be called ready, and it lay not inside the 4 walls at all, but just beyond the back door, where the Physic garden was waiting for its own portion of the morning's quiet attention. Let us step outside now into the cool air of first light and walk the narrow beds together before the day's first knock comes at the door. You would find the garden small, smaller than a modern visitor might expect from all the remedies that came out of it. A narrow strip of ground behind the shop enclosed by a low wattle fence to keep out wandering animals, laid out in beds no wider than an arm's reach, so that every plant could be tended without ever needing to step onto the soil itself. Dew would still be lying heavy on the leaves at this hour, and you would move along the beds slowly, the hem of your apron growing damp, checking each row the way you had checked the shelves inside, out of habit as much as necessity. The morning, you had learned long ago, was the proper time to gather many of the tenderest simples, before the sun had drawn the dew away, and with it, the old herbalists believed, some measure of the plant's own gathered strength. You would cut a handful of chamomile heads, still slightly closed against the cool air, laying them carefully into a shallow basket lined with clean linen so the delicate flowers would not bruise against one another on the short walk back inside. You would check the lavender, not yet ready for its main summer cutting, but sending up its first tentative spikes of color along the southern wall where it caught the most sun. You would pause at the rosemary bush, gnarled and woody with age, older by far than you were, and rub a sprig between your fingers simply for the pleasure of the scent, a small private habit none of your masters had ever taught you and none had ever needed to. Further along the bed, the mint would be spreading again, as it always did, threatening to overrun its neighbors the way it had threatened every year since the garden was first planted. And you would spend a few minutes pulling back its runners, a small unglamorous task that nonetheless mattered a great deal to the tidy, orderly nature of the whole enterprise. You would check the valerian, its roots the part that mattered, rather than its rather plain white flowers, and make a note in your mind to dig a portion of it come autumn, when its strength, by the old reckoning, would be at its fullest. You would look in on the mullein growing tall and soft-leaved against the back wall, its downy leaves already gathering the day's first light, gathered later in the season for chest complaints among the poor who could not afford the costlier, imported remedies kept inside. This garden, you would reflect, moving slowly along its narrow paths in the strengthening light, was not decoration. It was the shop's own quiet larder, the difference between a remedy that cost a coin or two and a remedy that cost nothing at all beyond the labor of tending a bed of soil through a full turning year. The imported spices and resins inside the shop, the ones that had traveled by ship and caravan from distant lands, were reserved by simple economic necessity for those who could afford them. But chamomile, mint, rosemary, and a dozen other humble plants growing here within a few steps of the back door, these belonged to everyone, rich and poor alike, and a good portion of your daily work, you had come to understand, was simply the patient tending of this small green plot so that it would keep giving season after season without ever needing to be asked twice. You would gather your basket, damp with dew and fragrant with the morning's cutting, and glance up at last toward the sky, judging the hour by its light, the way everyone did in a world before clocks were common in any home but the wealthiest. The grey had warmed towards something closer to gold now, low and slanting between the rooftops of the narrow street. It was nearly time. Somewhere across town the bells would soon ring for morning prayer, and not long after that, the shop's true work of the day would begin. You would carry the basket back inside, setting the chamomile heads out on a clean cloth near the fire to dry the last of the dew from their petals before they could be properly weighed and stored, and turn, at last, toward the workbench where the balance and its small brass weights stood waiting for the day's first careful task. Let us turn now to the balance itself and to the strange, exacting arithmetic that governed every single thing it weighed. You would lift the little brass beam from its resting place on the workbench and set it carefully on its stand, checking, as you always did, that the two pans hung level and true before you allowed yourself to use it for anything at all. This was the first lesson any apprentice learned about the balance, long before being trusted to weigh a single grain of anything that mattered. A balance that was not level could not be trusted, and a balance that could not be trusted was worse than no balance at all, because it gave the comforting appearance of precision while quietly lying the whole time. The weights themselves, wrapped in their soft cloth, were a small universe unto themselves, and you would unwrap them now with the same unhurried care you gave every morning, laying each one out in its accustomed place along the edge of the bench. The system you had learned as a child would seem, to a visitor from a later century, almost bewilderingly intricate, built not on the neat round numbers a modern mind reaches for, but on a scale inherited from apothecaries' medicine going back centuries before your own birth. 20 grains to the scruple, 3 scruples to the dram, 8 drams to the ounce, 12 ounces to the pound, and note always that the apothecary's pound was not the same pound the wool merchant across the square used for his bales of cloth. It had taken you the better part of your first 2 years simply to hold all of this steadily in your head, to reach without thinking for the correct small weight the moment a master called out a quantity. And even now, fully qualified, you still counted twice under your breath for anything unfamiliar. You would understand, better than almost anyone else in the town, that a grain was an almost absurdly small unit to a person unfamiliar with the trade, roughly the weight of a single plump grain of wheat, and yet entire remedies turned on differences measured in grains rather than anything larger. A dose of a gentle herb like chamomile could be generous, forgiving of a heavy hand, a scruple more or less making little practical difference to the result. But there were other simples on the highest shelf, kept behind the iron grate at the back of the shop, where a difference of a few grains sat between a remedy that eased a person's suffering and a preparation that could do them serious harm. This was the seriousness the old apothecary carried into every single weighing, not fear exactly, but a settled, unhurried respect for the fact that the tiny brass weights in your hand represented, in their own quiet way, the difference between help and harm. You would think, sometimes, of the story every apprentice in the guild was told at some point in their training, of a careless assistant in a shop 2 towns over who had reached, in haste, for the wrong small weight from an untidy drawer, and dispensed a preparation strong enough to make an old woman gravely unwell for the better part of a week before she recovered. The story was never told with relish, never told to frighten for its own sake. It was told the way a bridge builder might tell a story of a bridge that had once failed, calmly, factually, as a reason for the endless small precautions that otherwise might come to seem like needless fuss. You had never met the assistant in question, and did not know if the story was even entirely true in its details, the way such stories tend to grow and shift in the telling across a guild's collective memory. But you understood exactly why it was told, and exactly what it was meant to teach, which was simply this: respect the weights, keep them in their proper places. Never let haste or a full waiting room push you into skipping the careful counting that experience had made almost automatic, but must never become truly automatic, never something done without full attention. The morning's first weighing today would be a gentle one, thankfully, a preparation of dried chamomile heads for a regular customer. An elderly weaver's wife who came each fortnight for a small parcel to help her sleep through nights made restless by an aching hip. You would take down the jar of chamomile, dried now from the previous week's harvest, and set the correct small weight, 1/2 ounce, into one pan of the balance. Then begin adding the dried flowers to the other pan, a careful pinch at a time, watching the beam slowly level as the two sides drew nearer to balance. There was a particular pleasure in this part of the work, the slow visual conversation between the two pans, the beam swinging gently and then, with the last few flower heads added, settling into perfect stillness. A balance in true equilibrium had a stillness to it unlike anything else, a kind of visible silence, and you had come, over the years, to find something almost meditative in watching for that exact moment. You would fold the weighed flowers into a small paper packet, twisting the corners close the way you had been taught, and set it aside on the counter, ready for the weaver's wife when she arrived later in the morning. Then, because the shop's other regular customers would soon begin arriving too, you would move on to preparing a handful of other common orders in advance, weighing out small parcels of the gentler, more frequently requested simples, mint for stomach troubles, elderflower for the early hints of a summer cold, a mixture of thyme and honey base for a persistent cough that had been going around the parish since the weather turned. Each of these smaller weighings followed the same unhurried ritual, the correct weight set first into one pan, the herb added slowly, a pinch at a time, never poured carelessly all at once the way an impatient hand might be tempted to do. The beam watched closely for that moment of stillness, the finished parcel folded, labeled in your clearest hand, and set in its place. You would think, doing this, of how strange the whole process might look to someone who had never learned it, this patient, repetitive, almost ritual weighing of small quantities of dried plant matter. And yet you also understood, with the quiet certainty that 7 years of training had given you, that this patience was the entire foundation on which the trust of the whole town rested. A customer who bought a remedy from your shop did not watch you weigh it. They trusted, without seeing, that it had been weighed correctly, and that trust, invisible and unspoken, was worth more to the shop's good name than any amount of clever advertising or persuasive talk at the counter. By the time the sun had climbed a little higher, and the first sounds of a properly waking town filtered in through the open shutters, you would have 6 small parcels prepared and waiting, each one a tiny testament to an unhurried, exacting kind of care that the wider world outside the shop rarely paused to notice or appreciate. You would wrap the brass weights carefully back into their cloth for a moment, setting them within easy reach rather than fully away, because the day's weighing, you both knew, was very far from finished. Somewhere out beyond the shutters, the first footsteps were already approaching along the cobbled street, slow and a little uneven, the particular gait of someone in some measure of discomfort, and you would look up toward the door, setting the last folded parcel gently aside, ready for the day's first patient. The knock, when it came, was soft, almost apologetic. The knock of someone unused to asking for help, and slightly embarrassed to be doing so even now. You would cross the shop and lift the latch, and there, standing just outside in the pale morning light, would be an old man you recognized at once, a cooper by trade, his hands still faintly ringed with the dark stains of the barrel wood. he worked with every day of his life. He would hold one arm slightly away from his body, favoring it, and you would notice, before he had said a single word, the particular careful way he was breathing, shallow and measured, the breathing of a person trying not to jar something that hurt. You would invite him in with a quiet word, guiding him to the low stool kept beside the counter for exactly this purpose, and ask him gently and without any hurry in your voice to tell you what had happened. He would explain, a little sheepishly, that a barrel had shifted on him the evening before, catching his forearm awkwardly against the edge of his workbench, and that he had told himself all night it would ease on its own by morning, the way such things sometimes did, but that it had not eased, and his wife had finally insisted he come to you before it worsened further. You would take his arm carefully in both hands, turning it slowly, watching his face rather than the arm itself for the first moment, because a person's face would tell you a great deal about how much pain a given movement caused before their words ever caught up to it. You would find no obvious break, no grinding beneath your fingers, only a deep, spreading bruise along the forearm and a soreness that made him wince sharply when you pressed gently at its center. This was, you would judge, a matter for a poultice and rest, rather than anything more serious. And there was a particular quiet satisfaction in reaching that judgment calmly, without alarm, the same unhurried confidence your own master had shown you, all those years ago, at your own elbow. You would explain to him, in plain and steady words, what you believed had happened. A deep bruising of the muscle rather than anything broken beneath, and what you intended to do about it. A poultice of comfrey and a little vinegar to draw down the swelling. Bound firmly but not tightly with clean linen, and a full week's rest from any heavy lifting with that arm, difficult as that would surely be for a man who earned his living with his hands. He would not, visibly relieved, the tightness easing slightly from his shoulders, now that the uncertainty of not knowing had been replaced by the plain, ordinary comfort of a clear answer. You would turn then to the shelf where the dried comfrey leaves were kept, taking down the jar and beginning, once again, the same unhurried weighing you had performed a dozen times already that morning, the correct small weight set into the pan, the herb added slowly, the beam watched for its moment of stillness. There was nothing dramatic in any of it, nothing that would make for an exciting tale told at the tavern that evening. But the old cooper, watching your hands move with quiet, practiced care, would find in that very lack of drama something deeply reassuring, the plain evidence of a person who knew exactly what they were doing and was in no hurry at all to prove it. With the cooper settled and his poultice bound in place, sent home with careful instructions, repeated twice to be certain he had truly heard them, you would turn back to the workbench and to the next task waiting there, the compounding of a remedy that could not simply be weighed and folded into a paper packet, but had to be ground, pounded, and worked by hand into something entirely new. The mortar itself was a heavy thing, carved from a single block of pale stone, worn smooth on the inside from decades of grinding, its outer surface still rough, where the mason's chisel marks had never quite worn away. It had belonged to your master before you, and to his master before that, passed down the way certain tools in a trade like this one tended to be passed down, not for sentiment alone, though there was sentiment in it too, but because a good mortar, properly weighted and properly shaped, was simply difficult to replace, and once a person's hands had learned its particular balance, a new one always felt slightly wrong for months afterward. You would set the mortar firmly on the bench, steadying it with one hand out of long habit, even though it was heavy enough to sit perfectly still on its own, and begin measuring out the dried simples for today's compound. The order today was for a chest remedy, requested the previous evening by a neighbor whose youngest child had developed the thick, rattling cough that seemed to move through every household in the parish once the weather turned damp, and you would gather what the recipe called for: dried mullein leaves for their soothing, downy softness on an irritated throat, a portion of licorice root for its sweetness and its long reputation for loosening a stubborn cough, and a smaller quantity of hyssop, sharper and more bracing, to round out the mixture's effect. The pestle fit your hand the way it had fit your hand for years now, its handle worn to a particular smoothness by your own grip alone, since each apprentice in the shop tended, over time, to favor one pestle over the others kept on the shelf, and this one had become, without any formal claim ever being made, simply yours. You would begin with the licorice root, the hardest of the three ingredients, breaking it first into smaller pieces with your hands, before setting to work with the pestle in earnest, striking down with a controlled, rhythmic force that was nothing at all like the wild, hurried pounding an untrained hand might imagine. The sound filled the shop, a steady, muffled thud against stone, each strike landing in almost exactly the same place as the one before it, the roots slowly giving way from hard, fibrous chunks into something coarser, then finer, then finally a rough, fragrant powder that released its sweet scent into the air of the shop with every strike. There was a particular rhythm to good grinding, you had learned, one that took most apprentices the better part of a year to find in their own hands. Too fast, and the pestle would strike unevenly, scattering fragments up the sides of the mortar, rather than driving them properly down into the gathering powder at the center. Too tentative, and the work would simply take twice as long as it needed to, tiring the arm without achieving anything the steadier, more confident rhythm would have achieved in half the time. You had watched your own master grind for what felt like 1,000 hours across your years of training before you were ever trusted with a mortar of real consequence, and even now, fully qualified, you still found something almost hypnotic in the steady repetition, the way the mind could settle into the rhythm of the work, and let the hands simply continue without conscious direction. Thud against stone, the powder slowly rising finer and finer beneath the pestle's steady fall. The mullein leaves came next, dried and crumbling, requiring far less force than the tough licorice root had needed, and you would work them with a gentler, circling motion of the pestle, rather than the direct downward strikes, grinding rather than pounding, coaxing the dried leaves into a soft, fine texture that would blend easily with the coarser root powder already gathered at the bottom of the mortar. The hyssop followed last, its sharp, slightly bitter scent rising immediately as the pestle broke into its dried leaves and flowers, a scent that always made you think, for reasons you had never quite worked out, of the inside of a church in deep winter, incense and old stone somehow both at once. You would grind the three together now, folding the mixture over on itself, with the flat of the pestle between strikes, the way your master had shown you, so that the finished compound would be even throughout rather than layered. Each dose drawn from the finished jar, carrying a fair share of all three ingredients, rather than an accidental excess of whichever had happened to settle at the bottom. This folding motion, simple as it looked, had taken you longer to master than the grinding itself, requiring a particular light touch that resisted, for reasons you had never fully understood, being taught in words at all. Your master had simply performed it in front of you, over and over, across a full season of afternoons, until one day your own hands, without any conscious decision on your part, had simply begun doing it correctly, the way a fish might be said to simply begin swimming. The finished powder, when at last you judged it fine and even enough, would be a soft brownish grey, fragrant with licorice and hyssop, soft with the mullein's gentle bulk. You would decant it carefully into a clean glass jar, using a small horn spoon kept for exactly this purpose, so that no trace of anything else could contaminate the finished compound, and seal the jar with a cork stopper, then set it aside to be mixed later into a spoonful of honey for the child's actual dosing, since dried herb powder alone, however carefully prepared, was rarely something a young child could be persuaded to take without considerable protest. There is a particular satisfaction in this part of the trade that the weighing and measuring, careful as it was, did not quite offer in the same way. The weighing was exactness, the pure arithmetic of grains and scruples laid against one another until the beam found its stillness. The grinding was something closer to transformation, three separate, distinct plants, each with its own history and its own particular virtue, worked together by hand into a single new thing that was, in its finished form, more than the simple sum of its three parts. You had come to think of this, over the years, as perhaps the truest heart of the whole trade, not the selling, not even the diagnosing of a complaint, but this quiet, patient labor at the mortar, turning the raw gifts of field and garden into something a suffering person could actually take into their own body and be helped by. Your arm would ache faintly by the time the grinding was finished, a familiar, almost welcome ache that told you the work had been done properly and not rushed. You would wipe the mortar clean with its own dedicated cloth, never mixing it with the cloth used for the counter or the cloth used for the scales, and set the pestle back in its place, ready for whatever the next compound of the day might require. Outside, through the open shutters, the sounds of the town had grown fuller now. Cartwheels and voices, and the distant clang of the smith's hammer beginning its own working day, and you would glance toward the door, aware, without needing to check any clock, that the morning's first quiet hours were drawing to a close, and the busier part of the day was not far off. Before that busier stretch arrived, though, there was one more matter that belonged properly to the early morning, a task that had nothing to do with weighing or grinding at all, but with the slow, patient shaping of the next generation of the trade, because the shop, this particular morning, held not only you but a younger apprentice of your own, a girl of perhaps 14 named for a saint her mother had been devoted to, standing quietly at the far end of the workbench, watching as you once had watched, and waiting to be taught. You would call her over now and hold up, between two fingers, a small dried leaf taken at random from one of the lower shelves, and ask her, in the same patient, unhurried tone your own master had once used with you, what it was. She would hesitate, turning the leaf over carefully in the light from the window, and you would wait, saying nothing, because the waiting itself was part of the lesson. Too quick a correction you had learned from watching your own master teach, robbed a young apprentice of the small, valuable struggle of working it out for themselves, and the plants that were truly learned, the ones that stayed with a person for a lifetime, rather than slipping away after a single telling, were almost always the ones a young apprentice had wrestled with a little before finally arriving at the answer. She would guess, eventually, correctly, that it was sage, and you would nod and ask her the follow-up question your own master had always asked in turn, not simply what the plant was called, but what it could be mistaken for, because a name learned in isolation was worth very little in a trade where two different plants might sit only a few beds apart in a garden and look, to an untrained eye, almost identical. She would think a moment longer and offer a tentative guess, and you would gently correct the small error in her answer, not with impatience, but with the same steady patience that had once been extended to you, because you understood, perhaps better than she yet could, exactly how much depended on this slow, repetitive process of naming, questioning, and naming again, until the knowledge sat as firmly in her hands and her instincts as it now sat in yours. You would set her, next, to a small grinding task of her own, a batch of dried elderflower far gentler and more forgiving than anything on the high shelf, watching her grip on the pestle, correcting it lightly with a touch of your own hand over hers, showing rather than simply telling, the way it had always been shown to you. There was no urgency in any of this, no sense that she needed to master the whole trade in a single morning. The geld's 7 years stretched ahead of her, still long and unhurried, and your role this morning was simply to add one more small, careful stone to that long, slow foundation, the same way 100 small mornings, just like this one, back when you yourself were 14, had gradually built the trade into something that now lived in your own hands, almost without conscious thought. You would watch her work the pestle for a while longer, and as she settled into the rhythm of it, your mind would drift, the way a teacher's mind often does while watching a familiar task performed by unfamiliar hands, back to your own early lessons, and to the particular, careful way the guild insisted that certain knowledge be handed down. There were, you would remember, entire afternoons in your own apprenticeship devoted to nothing but the careful comparison of plants that looked, to an untrained eye, nearly identical. Your master would lay 2 dried specimens side by side on the bench, one entirely benign, one requiring far greater caution, and ask you to name the small differences between them, the faint variation in leaf shape, the particular way one stem branched and the other did not, the subtle difference in scent when a leaf was crushed between the fingers. This was not knowledge that could be learned from a single showing. It had to be shown again and again, across different seasons, because a plant gathered in spring looked subtly different from the same plant gathered in late summer, and a truly careful apothecary needed to recognize a simple in every stage of its growth, not merely in the single dried form kept on a shop shelf. The guild's own written roles, which you had been made to study closely in your final years before qualifying, were explicit about which plants belonged behind the iron grate at the back of every proper shop, kept locked and dispensed only by a senior member, never left within reach of an apprentice working alone. Certain roots that resembled closely enough to trouble even an experienced eye, plants used commonly and safely elsewhere in the shop. Certain seeds that a careless hand might mistake, in poor light or in haste, for something altogether milder. The guild had not arrived at this careful sorting by theory alone. It represented, in its own quiet way, generations of accumulated caution, the slow, collective memory of a trade that had learned, case by careful case, exactly where the true dangers lay, and had built its rules accordingly. You would explain some of this now to the young apprentice at your elbow, gently, and without any hint of alarm in your voice, because this was, you had come to believe firmly, the correct way to teach it. Fear made for careless hands, just as surely as ignorance did, perhaps more so, since a frightened apprentice might freeze at exactly the moment a calm, steady response was needed, or might avoid handling a difficult simple altogether, long after they should have grown confident enough to handle it properly. The seriousness the trade demanded was not the seriousness of dread. It was the seriousness of a careful craftsperson who simply respected their materials, the same steady respect a woodworker held for a very sharp blade, present in every motion without ever curdling into anxiety. You would tell her, as your own master had told you, that the guild's whole system of gradual trust, granting an apprentice access first to the gentlest simples and only slowly, over years, to the more consequential ones, existed precisely so that this respect could be built calmly, in small manageable steps, rather than thrust all at once upon a person unprepared for it. She would ask, as most young apprentices eventually asked, whether anyone in the shop's own long history had ever made a truly serious mistake, and you would answer honestly, because honesty, too, was part of the teaching. Yes, on rare occasion, across the generations the shop had stood on this street, there had been errors, some minor and quickly caught, one or two, in the shop's older written records, more serious. But you would tell her too that these errors were rare precisely because of everything she was now learning, the slow years of supervised practice, the locked grate, the constant careful checking, and that the guild's entire elaborate system existed not to frighten young apprentices with stories of disaster, but to make such disasters as rare as careful, patient human effort could possibly make them. This, you would think, watching her nod slowly, turning the lesson over in her mind the way you had once turned over lessons of your own, was perhaps the truest inheritance the trade offered. Not any single remedy or recipe, but this entire careful posture toward the work, patient, respectful, neither reckless nor fearful, built up one small lesson at a time across 7 unhurried years until it became, at last, simply how a person's hands move through the world. The bells would ring for mid-morning prayer, somewhere across the town, while you were still talking, a familiar, comforting sound that marked the day's slow passage the way nothing else quite did in a world without clocks in every home, and you would set the young apprentice to a final small task, sweeping the floor near the hearth clean of the morning's accumulated ash and herb dust, while you turned your own attention to the shop's front counter, where, through the open shutters, You could see the street outside filling steadily now with the ordinary business of a market town well into its morning. It was nearly time, you would realize, checking the small store of coin kept in the locked drawer beneath the counter, to make the walk across the square to the market itself, where the spice merchant's cart was said to have arrived the previous evening from the coast, laden, if the rumors circulating since dawn were to be believed, with a fresh consignment of the costlier imported goods the shop's own garden could never hope to supply. Cinnamon bark, perhaps, or a portion of true saffron, or the dark, resinous lumps of frankincense, burned in the wealthier households of the parish, for both their scent and their supposed virtues. You would need coin for this errand, and a clear head for the particular haggling such purchases always demanded, and you would leave the young apprentice in charge of the counter for the short while you were gone, trusting her, as your own master had once trusted you at roughly the same age, with the small, steady responsibilities that built, slowly and carefully, toward the greater ones still to come. Let us follow you now out through the open door, into the fuller light and noise of midday, and across the square to where the market has come fully alive. You would step out from the relative quiet of the shop into a street transformed, since the early hours of the morning, the cobbles crowded now with carts and baskets, and the particular loud, cheerful chaos of a market town at its busiest hour. Chickens complaining in wicker crates, a woman calling out the price of fresh eggs to anyone who would listen. The rich, mingled smell of wood smoke, animal dung, and somewhere beneath it all, the sweeter drift of baking bread from an oven 2 streets over. You would move through this crowd with the particular ease of someone who had walked this exact route hundreds of times before, nodding to faces you recognized, pausing briefly to exchange a word with a neighbor, until at last you reached the far corner of the square, where the spice merchant's cart stood surrounded by a small, attentive knot of the town's wealthier households and their servants. The merchant himself, a weathered man with the particular sun-darkened skin of someone who spent far more of his life on the road than settled in any one place, would greet you by name, as he greeted every apothecary along his regular circuit, because a good relationship with the local shop was, for a traveling spice merchant, worth considerably more over the years than squeezing every last coin from a single transaction. You would examine the goods laid out on his cart carefully, running a pinch of cinnamon bark between your fingers to judge its freshness by scent and color, checking a small dish of peppercorns for the telltale, wrinkled darkness of true quality, rather than the paler, lesser grade sometimes passed off to less careful buyers, and asking, as you always did, after the true origin of the saffron he offered. Since saffron above nearly everything else in the trade was subject to adulteration by unscrupulous sellers eager to stretch a small, genuine quantity with cheaper, similarly colored substitutes. The prices, when the merchant finally named them, would make you draw a slow breath, as they always did. Imported spices of this quality were not a purchase made lightly, and every apothecary in the guild understood that these costly items were, by simple economic necessity, remedies for the wealthier households of the parish, rather than for everyone equally, in a way the humble garden herbs behind your own shop never were. This was one of the quieter truths of the trade you had come to sit with over the years, neither entirely comfortable nor especially unusual for its age, simply the plain shape of a world where certain remedies traveled thousands of miles by ship and caravan and carried, inevitably, a cost that reflected every mile of that difficult journey. You would haggle a little, as custom expected, though not aggressively, since both you and the merchant understood the fair range of a reasonable price, and neither much enjoyed the theatre of pretending otherwise for too long, and settle at last on a modest purchase. A small quantity of cinnamon bark for the shop stores, a pinch of true saffron reserved for a wealthy patron who had specifically requested it the week before, and a portion of black pepper, sturdy and reliable, and always in steady demand. You would count the coin carefully from the small purse at your belt, the merchant weighing the goods himself on his own traveling scale, before wrapping them in oiled paper, and exchange a final few words about the roads he had traveled to reach the town and the news. Sparse and second-hand, he carried with him from other places along his circuit. Turning back toward the shop with your small parcel of costly goods tucked securely inside your apron, you would pause a moment longer in the crowded square, taking in, as you often did on this particular errand, the sheer breadth of the town's daily life spread out around you, the wool merchant's stall, the baker's boy weaving through the crowd with a tray balanced on one shoulder, a group of children chasing something small and quick across the cobbles, laughing. There was a particular pleasure in this brief interruption to the shop's quieter rhythms, a reminder, gentle and welcome, that the careful, patient work you did behind your own counter existed within this larger, noisier, thoroughly alive community, and that the remedies weighed so carefully on your small brass scales were, in the end, simply one thread among many holding the whole busy fabric of the town together. You would make your way back across the square as the midday sun climbed toward its highest point, the bells somewhere behind you beginning to ring for the noon hour, and turn in at last through the shop's open door, back into the familiar, settled quiet of dried herbs and beeswax, where the young apprentice would look up from her sweeping, relieved, in the particular way of someone who had been trusted with something a little larger than usual and had managed it without incident. The afternoon, you would find, rarely settled into any single steady rhythm the way the quieter hours of the morning had. It arrived instead in a series of small waves, a customer here, a quiet stretch there, and it was in one such wave, not long after the noon bells had faded, that a case arrived at your door requiring the full, careful weight of everything your 7 years of training had built in you. A young mother would appear at the threshold, her face drawn tight with the particular exhaustion of someone who has not slept properly in 2 nights, carrying against her shoulder a boy of perhaps 5 whose cheeks were flushed a deep, feverish pink, and whose small body, even from across the room, you could see trembling faintly with the effort of simply staying upright in his mother's arms. She would explain, her words tumbling out a little faster than usual, that the fever had come on 2 days before, mild at first, the sort of thing that often passed on its own within a day, but that it had worsened rather than eased, and that the boy had eaten almost nothing since, and slept only in short, restless bursts. You would draw the low stool nearer the window, where the light was best, and ask her gently to sit, taking the boy's small hand in your own for a moment, as you knelt to his level, speaking to him directly in the soft, unhurried voice you had learned over years of practice, tended to calm a frightened child far better than any brisk efficiency ever could. You would rest the back of your hand against his forehead, then his cheek, then the base of his throat, gathering, through this simple unhurried touch, a clearer sense of the fever's true heat than any anxious glance from across the room could have given you. You would count his breaths for a slow, silent minute, watching the small rise and fall of his chest, and take his pulse at the wrist with 2 fingers, the way your own master had drilled into you, until the counting had become almost automatic, comparing what you found against the long, patient accumulation of similar cases you had witnessed across your years of training. This was, you would judge, watching him a moment longer, a fever, uncomfortable, and clearly wearing on both mother and child, but not, as far as your careful examination could tell, one of the more frightening sort that occasionally moved through a parish and demanded far graver caution, and, more often than not, referral to the town's physician rather than anything the apothecary's own shop could properly address. The boy's color, though flushed, was not the alarming grey pallor you had been taught, gravely, to watch for. His breathing, though quick, was not the labored, rattling struggle that marked the truly dangerous cases. This was, in the calm, careful language of your training, an ordinary fever, the kind that responded, more often than not, to rest, to fluids, and to a gentle herbal preparation that could ease the worst of the discomfort, while the body's own strength did the greater share of the actual healing. The particular difficulty in front of you now, though, was not the diagnosis itself, which had settled fairly quickly once you had properly examined him, but the dosing, and it was here, more than almost anywhere else in the trade, that the careful precision drilled into you across 7 long years mattered most acutely. A remedy measured correctly for a grown man's frame would very likely be far too strong for a small child of 5, and the old apothecary's art, passed down through generations of careful practice, held that dosing had to be scaled thoughtfully to the person receiving it, weighed against their age, their size, the particular strength of their constitution, as best you could judge it, rather than applied as a single unvarying measure to everyone who walked through the door. You would explain this, briefly and without any alarm in your voice, to the boy's mother, who was watching your hands now with the close, hopeful attention of a person placing real trust in a stranger's careful judgment. The preparation you had in mind, a gentle infusion built around elderflower and yarrow, both mild enough to be forgiving, even to a small child's frame, would need to be measured at perhaps 1/3 of the strength you would prepare for an adult, and you would explain, as you moved to the shelf to gather the dried simples, exactly why this mattered, that a child's smaller body responded far more readily and far more quickly to a given quantity of any remedy, gentle or otherwise, and that the Guild's entire careful teaching on dosing existed precisely to protect against the temptation, understandable in a worried moment, to simply give more in the hope of a faster effect. You would set the balance level on the workbench, exactly as you had a dozen times already that day, and select the correct small weights with the same unhurried care you brought to every single weighing, regardless of how urgently the matter in front of you seemed to press. This was, you had come to understand deeply over your years of training. The truest test of the calling, not the diagnosing, which came with enough experience, almost naturally, but the discipline of slowing down precisely at the moment when every instinct in a worried room urged a person to hurry. The mother's anxious eyes on your hands, the boy's small, uncomfortable whimper as he shifted against her shoulder. None of it, you had learned, was permitted to rush the careful counting of grains and scruples that stood between a properly measured remedy and one that was not. You would weigh the elderflower first, then the yarrow, each in its own careful turn, the beam settling into its familiar moment of stillness before you moved to the next measure, and combine them in a small clean vessel with water you had already set warming gently over the hearth, not boiling, which the old teaching held could damage the more delicate virtues of certain flowers, but warm enough to draw out their gentle properties over a slow, patient steeping. You would explain to the mother, while the infusion steeped, exactly how it should be given. Small sips rather than large draughts, offered every few hours rather than all at once, and warm rather than hot, since a feverish child's stomach, unsettled already, often rebelled against anything too strong or too abrupt. You would explain, too, the signs that would tell her the fever was easing on its own. A gradual cooling of the skin, a return of some appetite, longer stretches of proper sleep, and, just as calmly, the signs that would mean the boy needed to be seen by the town's physician rather than treated further at home, a fever that climbed rather than eased despite a full day and night of rest and gentle remedy, a rash appearing anywhere on his small body, breathing that grew more labored rather than easier. You would say all of this steadily, without any theatrical weight in your voice, because you had learned, across years of watching your own master do exactly this, that a frightened parent needed clear, calm information laid out, plainly far more than they needed reassurance dressed up as certainty, and that your role, in moments like this one, was to be the single steady point in an otherwise frightening day, not by minimizing the real seriousness of illness, but by meeting it with exactly the same unhurried, careful attention you brought to every other task of the day. The infusion, once properly steeped, would be strained carefully through a clean cloth into a small stoppered flask, and you would show the mother, using your fingers to demonstrate the small quantity involved, exactly how much to give the boy at each sitting, repeating the instruction a second time to be certain it had truly landed, the way you repeated instructions to every worried parent, because words spoken to a person carrying a sick child in their arms had a way of slipping past a tired, frightened mind, no matter how clearly they were first delivered. You would press the flask gently into her free hand and offer, too, the plain practical advice that belonged just as much to the trade as any herb did, that the boy should be kept warm but not overheated, given water often even if he did not ask for it, and allowed to sleep as much as his small restless body would permit. She would thank you, her shoulders visibly loosening now that the uncertainty had been replaced by a clear plan, and you would walk her to the door, resting a hand briefly and lightly on the boy's small back as she gathered him more securely against her shoulder for the walk home. There was no dramatic resolution in any of this, no sudden moment of relief or triumph, only the quiet, steady transfer of careful, hard-won knowledge from your hands into hers, and the trust, built over years of the shop's careful reputation in the town, that this transfer could be relied upon. You would stand a moment in the open doorway after she had gone, watching her make her slow way back down the street, the boy's small head resting now against her shoulder, already looking, even at this early distance, a shade more settled than he had a half hour before. Though you knew perfectly well that the true easing of his fever would take a day or more yet of patient rest and gentle care, rather than any single visit to your shop. This, too, was part of the trade's quiet discipline, the acceptance that most of the real healing happened slowly, outside your own walls, in a warm bed at home, rather than in the dramatic moment of any single remedy being handed across a counter, and that your part in it, however carefully and skillfully performed, was simply one small, necessary link in a longer chain. You would turn back inside and find the young apprentice watching you from across the shop, her sweeping forgotten for the moment, her expression carrying the particular quiet awe of someone who had just watched, for the first time in real earnest rather than in any lesson, the full weight of everything her own long training was slowly building toward. You would not say very much about it, not yet, because there would be time enough in the years ahead for her to understand, the way you yourself had come to understand only gradually, exactly what it meant to hold a frightened parent's trust so lightly and so carefully in your own two hands. For now, you would simply nod toward the half-swept floor and toward the afternoon's remaining tasks, still waiting patiently at the workbench, and the shop's steady rhythm would resume, unhurried, as it always did, regardless of how much weight any single hour had carried. The middle stretch of the afternoon, once the morning's steadier stream of ordinary customers had thinned, and before the particular rush of early evening began, belonged to a different kind of work entirely, slower still than even the careful weighing and grinding of the morning, the patient art of distilling and tincture making that kept the shop's deeper shelves stocked through the long months when fresh simples from the garden were not to be had. You would move to the small still kept in the back corner of the shop, a modest copper vessel set over its own dedicated brazier, cooler now than it had been earlier in the week when you had last used it in earnest, and begin preparing it for a fresh batch of rose water, requested by no fewer than 3 separate households in recent days for its gentle use in easing tired eyes and its pleasant, mild application to the skin. You would fill the vessel's lower chamber with fresh rose petals gathered from the garden's small dedicated bed just 2 mornings before, still faintly fragrant even after their careful drying, and add water in the careful proportion your master had taught you, neither too little, which risked scorching the delicate petals before their virtue had properly transferred into the rising steam, nor too much, which diluted the finished water past any real usefulness. The fire beneath the still needed a particular kind of tending, unlike the brisker flame you kept for ordinary warmth, low and steady rather than high and eager, and you would feed it small, careful portions of fuel across the better part of an hour, watching for the first thin wisp of steam to rise from the vessel's curved neck and begin its slow journey through the cooled copper coil that ran down into the waiting collection flask. This was patient work in the truest sense, work that could not be hurried by any amount of impatience or urgency, since the whole delicate process depended entirely on a slow, steady heat drawing the rose's gentle virtue up into vapor and carrying it, drop by careful drop, down into the clear liquid gathering in the flask below. You would sit near the still for long stretches at a time, tending the fire, watching the first clear drops begin to fall, catching in your palm every so often a tiny sample to test by scent, judging by nothing more scientific than long-practiced instinct exactly when the water had drawn enough of the rose's character to be worth bottling and when it had begun, instead, to run thin and characterless, its usefulness already spent. While the still worked its slow, patient business in the corner, you would turn your attention to a separate task at the main workbench, the steeping of a tincture begun some weeks before, and now, by the calendar you kept faithfully in the shop's ledger, finally ready to be strained and bottled. This particular preparation, a strengthening tincture built around angelica root and a little wine, had been sealed in its dark glass vessel and set on the high shelf away from direct light for the full 6 weeks the old recipe called for. The slow, steady steeping drawing the root's full virtue into the wine far more thoroughly and far more gently than any hurried extraction over direct heat ever could. You would lift the vessel down carefully, checking first, by the faint amber color visible through the glass, that the steeping had progressed properly, and set to work straining the finished liquid through several careful layers of fine linen cloth, pressing the spent root gently at the end to draw out every last useful drop, without forcing through any of the coarser sediment that would cloud the finished tincture and shorten its useful life on the shelf. This straining, simple as it sounded, demanded its own particular patience, since a hurried hand pressing too hard or too fast tended to push fine particles through even the tightest cloth, and you had learned, across several early mistakes in your own training, that a tincture strained properly the first time saved a great deal of trouble later, when a cloudy remedy might otherwise need to be strained a second or even third time before it was fit to sell. The finished tincture, clear and deep amber in the afternoon light, would be decanted carefully into a row of smaller bottles, each one measured to a standard dose so that a customer purchasing the remedy would know, without any further weighing or measuring on your part, exactly how much to take at a single sitting. This was, you would reflect, watching the amber liquid catch the light as it settled into each small bottle. One of the quieter conveniences your own generation of apothecaries had come to rely on more heavily than your master's generation ever had: the practice of pre-measuring certain steady, reliable remedies into standard doses rather than weighing every single portion fresh at the moment of sale. It saved time on a busy afternoon, certainly, but it demanded, in exchange, an even greater care at the moment of preparation, since a single careless batch, once divided among a dozen small bottles, could carry its error into a dozen separate households rather than just one. Labeling came next, and it was a task you approached with nearly as much careful attention as the weighing itself, because a bottle without a clear, legible label was, in its own way, almost as dangerous as a poorly measured one. You would take down the small pot of ink, kept specifically for this purpose, thinned slightly to flow more easily onto the small parchment tags tied to each bottle's neck, and write, in the clear, careful hand every apprentice was drilled in for years, before being trusted to label anything meant for sale, the name of the preparation, its intended use, and the proper dose and timing for taking it. Your own master had been particular, almost fierce, about legibility above all else, reminding you more than once in your early years that a beautifully composed remedy meant nothing at all if the household that purchased it could not read, in a dim room by a single candle, exactly how much of it to take and when. You would work steadily through the row of small bottles, the rose water now finished too, its clear, faintly fragrant liquid decanted into its own set of labeled flasks, and set the finished stock onto the appropriate shelves, restocking the front counter's small display where the more commonly requested preparations were kept within easy reach, and returning the rarer or more costly items to the deeper shelves where they waited patiently for the particular customer who might need them. There was a quiet satisfaction in this restocking, a visible, tangible sense of the day's labor translated into something the shop could now offer with confidence, and you would pause a moment, surveying the freshly filled shelves, feeling something very close to the settled pride your own master used to show, without ever quite naming it as such, at the end of a productive afternoon. The young apprentice, having finished her sweeping some time before, would have moved on by now to a task of her own, carefully copying a simple recipe from the shop's worn recipe book into a smaller notebook of her own, a habit every serious apprentice in the guild eventually took up, building across their years of training a personal record of the preparations they had watched and gradually begun to make themselves. You would glance over her careful, still slightly uneven handwriting from time to time, offering a small correction here and there, and feel, watching her bent studiously over the page, the particular quiet continuity of the trade passing itself forward, generation after generation, one careful notebook at a time. Outside, the light through the shop's open shutters would have begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift, the high, bright directness of early afternoon giving way, slowly, to something a little longer and more golden, the sun beginning its own slow, unhurried descent toward the rooftops on the far side of the square. You would feel it before you consciously noticed it, the particular quality of light that told every experienced apothecary, long before any bell confirmed it, that the day was moving now into its later hours, and that the shop's quieter afternoon work would soon give way again to the more varied demands of early evening, when the poorer households of the parish, finished at last with their own long day's labor, tended most often to make their way to your door. The evening's first knock, when it came, was not soft and apologetic like the Coopers had been that morning, but hesitant in a different way entirely. The particular hesitation of someone standing at a threshold they were not entirely certain they had the right to cross. You would open the door to find a woman you knew only slightly, a laborer's wife from the poorer lane down near the river, holding a basket against her hip with both hands, as though it were the only thing steadying her. She would explain, her eyes not quite meeting yours at first, that her husband had taken a persistent cough some 10 days back that showed no sign of easing, and that she had come to ask, if it were not too much trouble, whether there was anything you might spare, though she had, she admitted quietly, very little coin to offer in return. This was, you would reflect, drawing her gently inside, rather than leaving her standing uncertainly at the threshold. One of the oldest and quietest obligations of the trade, older by far than the guild's written rolls, though the guild had eventually written it down anyway, that an apothecary did not turn away the honest poor simply because their purse was thin. Your own master had been firm about this from your very first year of training, telling you plainly that a shop which served only those who could pay handsomely was not truly serving the parish at all, but merely trading, and that the guild oath's promise to turn away no honest custom of the poor was meant exactly as seriously as every other line in it. You would ask her, as you asked every patient regardless of what they carried in their purse, to describe the cough properly, how it sounded, whether it brought anything up, whether it worsened at night or eased with rest. And she would answer carefully, clearly relieved to be asked with the same attention you would have given a wealthier customer. The cough, by her description, sounded deep but not alarming, the sort that settled into a hard-working man's chest through cold, damp weeks of outdoor labor and lingered stubbornly once it arrived, uncomfortable and wearing rather than genuinely dangerous, though you would tell her plainly, too, the signs that would mean he ought to be seen properly rather than simply dozed at home. Blood in what he coughed up, a fever that would not break, breathing that grew steadily worse rather than better. You would move to the shelf where a batch of the chest remedy you had ground fresh that very morning, mullein and licorice and hyssop, was now cooling in its sealed jar, and measure out a generous portion into a small paper packet, along with careful instructions for mixing it into warm honeyed water twice a day. When she reached, uncertainly, for the small worn purse at her waist, you would wave the gesture away, gently but without any theatre about it, the way your own master had always done, explaining simply that this one was on the shop's own account, and that she was welcome, whenever her circumstances allowed it, to bring by whatever she could spare, no obligation attached either way. She would insist, as the honest poor so often did, that she could not accept charity outright, and would set her basket down on the counter, drawing back its cloth to reveal a dozen fresh eggs, still faintly warm from that morning's gathering, offering them plainly as fair payment rather than accept the remedy for nothing at all. This, too, was a familiar and comfortable rhythm of the trade, one the guild's own rolls acknowledged without any real objection, the quiet barter economy that ran alongside the shop's coin transactions, eggs, a measure of good wool, an offer of mending or repair, a basket of garden vegetables in season, exchanged for remedies at a value both sides understood well enough without ever needing to state it aloud. You would accept the eggs graciously, setting them carefully into the shop's own small larder, where they would be used in the ordinary course of things, in your own household supper that very evening, and see her out with a warm word and the same unhurried care you had shown every other customer of the day. The knocks that followed through the early evening carried their own particular variety, the way they always did once the poorer, working households of the parish had finished their own long day's labor and finally found a spare hour to attend to matters they had been putting off since morning. An old widow would arrive next, walking slowly with the aid of a stick, seeking a small salve for the persistent ache in her knees that worsened, as it did every year, with the damp turning of the season. and you would prepare it for her at the modest, fixed price the shop kept for its most commonly requested remedies, well below what the ingredients and labor alone might reasonably have commanded, because the guild understood, and you had come fully to understand in turn, that certain steady, reliable remedies needed to remain within easy reach of even the most modest household, or the whole quiet purpose of the trade would be betrayed. A young man, a stonemason's apprentice by the dust still clinging to his clothes, would come next, seeking something for a persistent skin irritation that had spread uncomfortably across both forearms in recent weeks. Likely, you would judge after a careful look, some reaction to the lime dust his own trade required him to handle daily. You would prepare a simple, soothing ointment built around comfrey and a little beeswax, and take in payment the promise of an afternoon's mending work on the shop's own back fence, which had been leaning rather alarmingly since the previous winter's storms, an arrangement that suited both of you rather better, in truth, than a straightforward coin exchange would have. Later still, as the light through the shutters began its final, slower fade toward evening proper, a barefoot boy of perhaps 9 would appear at the door, sent, he explained in a rush of words, by his mother, who had taken to her bed that morning with a fever and a headache that would not ease. You would gather a small portion of the willow bark preparation, kept for exactly such complaints, its bitter properties well regarded across generations of apothecary practice for easing pain and drawing down a stubborn fever, and press it into the boy's hands along with careful, simple instructions repeated slowly enough that a frightened 9-year-old, however earnestly he was trying to listen, would actually retain them on the walk home. When he explained, a little breathlessly, that his family had nothing at all to offer in exchange this week, you would tell him kindly, and without the smallest hint of reluctance, that this one, too, was simply given freely, and watch him run off down the darkening street, relieved of at least one small worry, in what had clearly already been a difficult day for his household. There was, you would think, watching the boy disappear around the corner of the square, a particular kind of accounting that ran beneath the shop's more visible ledger of coins received and goods exchanged, an accounting that never appeared in any written record, but that every apothecary worth their guild oath kept somewhere in the quieter part of their own conscience. The eggs, the mending, the willow bark given freely to a frightened boy, none of it added up, in any strict arithmetic sense, to the shop's continued survival on its own. But taken together, across a full year of such small exchanges, it built something else entirely, a deep, settled trust between the shop and the poorer households of the parish that no amount of clever pricing could have purchased any other way, and it was this trust, as much as any single remedy on the shelf, that had kept your master's shop, and now increasingly your own hands within it, standing on this same street for as long as anyone in the parish could clearly remember. You would think, too, of the guild's oath itself, sworn all those years ago with your hand flat on its worn, dark book, and of the particular line about turning away no honest custom of the poor, and understand more fully with every such evening than any single explanation from your master had ever quite managed to convey, exactly why the guild had thought it necessary to write that promise down at all, rather than simply trusting every apothecary to arrive at the same generous instinct on their own. The trade offered real power, the power of knowledge that could ease genuine suffering, and power of that particular kind, left entirely to the discretion of whoever happened to hold it, did not always incline itself naturally toward the poorest and least able to pay. The oath existed to make certain it did anyway, at least within these four walls, on this particular street, for as long as the shop continued to stand. The young apprentice, watching all of this unfold across the evening's steady procession of modest, ordinary need, would ask you at one point, during a brief lull between customers, whether the shop ever struggled, given how much of its work seemed to be given away or exchanged for eggs and mending rather than proper coin. You would smile a little at the question, recognizing in it exactly the sort of practical worry any sensible young apprentice ought to raise, and explain honestly that the shop balanced itself across the whole of its custom taken together, the costlier remedies sold to wealthier households, helping to offset the quieter, generous accounts kept with poorer ones, and that a well-run shop, over enough years, tended to find its own steady equilibrium, provided the apothecary keeping it never lost sight of which side of that balance mattered more in the end. This, too, you would tell her, was part of what the balance on the workbench represented, not merely grains and scruples, but a wider kind of fairness the whole trade was quietly built upon, if it was practiced properly and with the patience the guild had always demanded of it. As the last of the poor households, evening visits thinned, and the light through the shutters deepened toward the particular gold of late afternoon, a different kind of knock would come. Brisker and more businesslike, and you would open the door to find not a patient at all, but a servant from the household of the town's physician, holding a folded slip of parchment out toward you with the slightly self-important air of someone entrusted with an errand from a person of standing. The physician and the apothecary shop, you had come to understand well across your years of training, occupied two related but distinctly separate roles within the town's wider care of the sick, and the relationship between the two, when it worked well, ran smoothly in both directions. A physician trained at university in the theory of the body's humors and the causes of disease, examined patients, particularly the wealthier ones who could afford his fee, and prescribed, often in careful written form, the particular remedy he judged the case required. The apothecary's task, then, was not to question that diagnosis, which lay properly outside your own trained competence, but to prepare the prescribed remedy exactly, faithfully, and with every bit of the same careful precision you brought to every other preparation in the shop. You would unfold the parchment and read the physician's careful hand, written in the Latin every educated person of standing used for such formal matters, though your own years of guild training had given you more than enough familiarity with that particular vocabulary to read it easily. The prescription called for a compound built around several ingredients together, a portion of gentian root for its bitter, strengthening properties, a measure of cinnamon for warmth, a careful small quantity of a costlier resin kept on the higher shelf, all combined in a particular proportion the physician had specified exactly, intended for an elderly merchant of the parish who had been suffering, by the servant's own account, while you read, from a persistent weakness and lack of appetite that had troubled him through the past several weeks. This was work that demanded a different kind of attention than the remedies you prepared from your own judgment across an ordinary day. Because here the careful thinking about the case itself had already been done by another trained hand, and your entire responsibility narrowed down to the single, exacting task of following the written formula with absolute fidelity. You would read the prescription through a second time before touching a single ingredient, the way your own master had drilled into you as an unbreakable habit, checking the proportions specified against your own knowledge of what a safe and reasonable dose for each ingredient looked like. Because even a physician's careful hand was not infallible, and the guild expected every apothecary to serve, in some quiet sense, as a final careful check on any prescription that passed through their hands, gently querying anything that seemed genuinely amiss, rather than simply compounding it without question. Satisfied that the proportions specified were sound and reasonable, well within the range your training told you was safe for a person of the described age and constitution, you would move to the workbench and begin the careful work of gathering each ingredient in turn. The gentian root first, bitter and pale, taken down from its jar and weighed with the same unhurried care you brought to every weighing of the day, the beam settling into its familiar stillness before you moved on. The cinnamon next, its warm, sweet scent filling the immediate air around the workbench as you broke a portion from the bark, purchased only that very morning from the spice merchant's cart, weighed in turn with the same exact care. The costlier resin last, taken from behind the locked grate at the back of the shop, a preparation you handled with the particular, heightened attention every apothecary reserved for anything kept in that restricted portion of the stock, checking the weight not once but twice before adding it to the growing compound in your mortar. The grinding and combining that followed took the better part of half an hour, the pestle working steadily through the mixed ingredients until they had blended into a single fine, fragrant powder, bitter and warm and faintly resinous all at once, and you would decant the finished compound into a small glass vessel, sealing it carefully and labeling it, not merely with a general description, as you did for your own shop's ordinary remedies, but with a precise notation of the exact formula used, the physician's name, and the date of preparation, because a compound made to a physician's specific written order carried, in the guild's careful record-keeping, its own particular weight of accountability distinct from an ordinary remedy dispensed on your own judgment alone. You would hand the finished preparation to the waiting servant along with the exact instructions the physician's prescription had specified for its taking, and watch him carry it away back across the square toward the wealthier quarter of the town where the elderly merchant's household stood, reflecting, as the door closed behind him, on the particular quiet satisfaction this kind of work always carried, different in its texture from the satisfaction of easing a frightened child's fever or binding a laborer's bruised arm, but no less real for being different. There was something settling you had come to feel in serving as one careful link in a longer chain of trained attention, the physician's careful diagnosis, your own careful compounding, and at the far end of it, a person you had never even met, resting a little easier for the exacting, unhurried work that had passed through your two trained hands before ever reaching his own. The light outside, had shifted further still while you worked, the gold of late afternoon deepening now toward the softer, more amber tones of early evening, and you would allow yourself a brief pause at the counter, wiping down the workbench where the compound had been prepared before the day's very last visitor arrived at the door. She would come slowly, an elderly woman you had known your entire life, a former midwife of the parish, now retired from active practice but still, in her own quiet way, consulted regularly by younger women of the town for advice her decades of experience had earned her. She would not be seeking any remedy for herself tonight, she would explain, settling gracefully onto the low stool beside the counter, but had simply come, as she did every so often at this quiet hour, to sit a while and talk, and perhaps to see what new stock the spice merchant's recent visit had brought into the shop. You would welcome this brief, unhurried visit gladly, setting aside the last of the counter's tidying to sit with her a few minutes, and she would tell you, in the easy, familiar way of an old friend, rather than a formal customer, small pieces of news from around the parish, which households had welcomed new children in recent weeks, which elderly neighbors were struggling more than usual with the changing season. The particular small threads of community knowledge that never appeared in any guild roll or written ledger, but that mattered, in their own quiet way, every bit as much to the shop's ongoing usefulness to the town. She would ask, too, after the young apprentice's progress, having known the girl's own mother well, and offer a few words of gentle encouragement directly to the apprentice herself, the kind of encouragement that meant a great deal more coming from a woman who had spent her own long life easing the fears of frightened households across the parish. When she rose at last to leave, refusing gently your offer of a small parcel of chamomile to take home with her, insisting her own small garden supplied all she needed of that particular herb, you would walk her to the door and watch her make her slow, steady way back down the darkening street, thinking, as you often did after one of her quiet visits, of how much of the trade's true value lived in exactly this kind of unhurried human connection, threads of trust and familiarity woven patiently across decades, that no single remedy on any shelf could ever fully account for on its own. The old midwife's departure marked, as it often did, the quiet turning point of the day, the moment when the shop's business proper drew to its natural close and the slower, more private work of closing up began, and you would feel it settle over you the way it always did, a gentle loosening of the alert, ready attention you had carried since before dawn, replaced now by something calmer and more inward-facing. You would draw the shutters partway closed first, not fully yet, since the last stubborn stragglers of the day occasionally still wandered by in the deepening dusk, but enough to signal to anyone glancing at the shop from the darkening square that the day's main business had concluded. The light inside would shift immediately with this small change, the last low rays of the setting sun no longer reaching directly across the counter, and you would move to light the shop's evening lamps, the same careful ritual, in reverse, that had opened the day so many hours before, trimming each wick to a clean, steady flame and setting the lamps in their accustomed places along the counter and the workbench. The ledger came next, kept in a heavy-bound book on a small shelf beneath the counter, its pages filled across many years now with the careful, cramped handwriting of your own hand, layered over the earlier, slightly different hand of your master before you, each day's transactions recorded in turn, coin received, goods bartered, remedies given freely to those the shop's own quiet charity had judged deserving. You would settle onto the tall stool, kept specifically for this purpose, drawing the lamp a little closer, and begin the evening's careful accounting, working back through the day's business one transaction at a time, while it was still fresh enough in memory to record accurately. The chamomile sold to the weaver's wife, the comfrey poultice for the cooper, and his promise, in the absence of ready coin that particular week, to repair a section of the shop's back fence before the month was out. The mullein and hyssop compound given to the labourer's wife in exchange for a dozen fresh eggs, already eaten at your own family's supper table that very evening. The willow bark given freely to the frightened 9-year-old boy, entered in the ledger's separate column reserved for charity given without any expectation of return. A column your master had insisted upon keeping distinct from the shop's ordinary trade precisely, so that its true extent, tallied honestly at each year's end, could never be quietly forgotten or minimized. The physician's costly compound, its fee already settled that afternoon and duly noted. Small parcel after small parcel, each one a tiny thread in the larger fabric of the day, recorded now in careful ink, so that the shop's accounts, checked periodically by the guild's own auditors as part of its ongoing oversight of every member's practice, would stand, as they always had, in honest and transparent order. This accounting, tedious as a stranger to the trade might have judged it, held its own particular satisfaction for you, a settling, retrospective clarity that let the whole scattered variety of the day's individual moments resolve on the page into a single coherent record. You would total the modest coin taken in against the modest expenses of the day, the spice merchant's goods purchased that morning, the small cost of replacing a worn cloth or a cracked jar, and find, as you nearly always did, that the shop's accounts balanced out to a fair, steady, unspectacular profit, enough to keep the household comfortably provided for, without ever making any single member of it especially wealthy, which was, in truth, precisely the modest, honourable position the trade had always occupied within the wider life of the town. With the ledger closed and returned to its shelf, you would turn at last to the task that closed every single day in exactly the same careful, unvarying way regardless of how busy or how quiet the hours before it had been, the securing of the poison cupboard. The iron grate at the back of the shop, behind which the most dangerous of all the simples in your care were kept, stood already locked through the day's ordinary business, opened only by your own hand, or in your absence, by no one at all. But the evening's closing ritual demanded a final, thorough check regardless, a careful counting of what remained on each shelf behind the grate against what the day's written record showed should be there, confirming, beyond any possible doubt, that nothing had gone astray. You would move slowly along the narrow row of jars kept behind the iron bars, checking each one in turn by the lamp's steady light. The dried mandrake root, the small careful store of foxglove leaves, the dark, heavy seeds of the poppy, kept for the rare occasions when nothing gentler would serve a suffering patient's genuine need. Each container checked against its written record, each stopper confirmed tightly sealed, each label confirmed still clearly legible. This was, you had come to understand across your years of training, perhaps the single most sacred task of the entire day, the quiet, unwitnessed confirmation that the trust placed in your hands by the guild, by the physician who occasionally relied on these very simples for his own careful prescriptions, and by the whole wider town that walked past this shop every day without a second thought, remained, this evening as every evening, entirely deserved. Satisfied at last that every jar stood exactly where its record said it should, you would draw the heavy iron grate closed and turn the key in its lock, a solid, reassuring click that you had heard so many thousands of times across your years in this shop that it had become, in its own way, one of the most familiar sounds of your entire life. You would slip the key onto the cord you wore always beneath your clothing, never left hanging visibly on any hook where a careless moment might let it fall into the wrong hands, a small habit that had been impressed upon you so early and so thoroughly in your training that you could no longer quite remember a time before it had simply become instinct. The fire needed banking next. The same patient, unhurried care you had given it every single evening, raking the glowing coals into a careful, compact heap at the center of the hearth and covering them with a fine layer of ash, enough to hold a low, steady warmth through the night without any risk of the flame catching properly and spreading unattended while the household slept. You would check the hearth twice, as you always did, before finally satisfied that the fire was safely banked, because a shop full of dried herbs and oils represented, you understood clearly, a genuine fire risk that demanded exactly the same careful, unhurried respect you gave to every other danger of the trade. You would walk the shop's narrow length one final time before extinguishing the lamps, the same slow, checking walk that had opened the day so many hours before, confirming the shutters properly barred, the counter cleared and wiped, the mortar and pestle cleaned and returned to their places, the balance's small brass pans hanging level and still in the near darkness. The young apprentice, having finished her own final small tasks of sweeping and tidying, would wait by the stair. Her earlier energy of the day settled, now into the particular quiet tiredness of someone who had worked genuinely hard from before dawn until well past dusk, and you would send her up ahead of you, telling her, as you told her most evenings, that she had done well, that the small, careful lessons of the day would settle properly into her hands with enough repetition, the way they had once settled into your own. You would stand a final moment alone in the near dark of the closed shop before following her up the stair, the last lamp still burning low on the workbench, its small steady flame the only light left in the whole quiet room. The bundles of dried herbs hanging from the beams overhead, their outlines soft and indistinct now in the failing light. The rows of jars along the shelves, each one holding, in its own quiet way, some small measure of the field or garden or distant trade route it had come from, waiting patiently for tomorrow's careful hands to put it to use again. The mortar, clean and still on its shelf, the balance level and true. The whole shop in this last quiet moment of the day, holding itself in exactly the same patient, orderly readiness it had held every single evening, for as long as the shop had stood, and would very likely go on holding for many years yet to come. You would draw the last breath of the day's smell deep into your lungs, one final time, dried thyme and beeswax, and the faint lingering warmth of the banked fire, and lift the final small lamp from the workbench, carrying its soft light with you as you climbed the narrow stair, leaving the shop below to settle, as it always did, into its own quiet, watchful darkness until morning. Upstairs, in the small warm room above the now sleeping shop, the day would not quite end so simply, because a life built around this particular trade rarely confined its lessons neatly to the hours between opening the shutters and closing them again, and you would find yourself, most evenings, still turning over some small piece of the day's work, even as you settled toward your own rest. You would think, on an evening like this one, of how differently this same closing ritual felt depending on the season, because the shop's rhythm, steady and unvarying in its basic shape from one day to the next, shifted considerably across the slow turning of the year in ways that only someone who had lived through many full cycles of it could properly appreciate. In deep winter, the shutters would have been drawn closed on a day, already fully dark for hours, before the ledger was even open. The fire banked against a cold that pressed hard against the shop's stone walls, all through the long night, and the garden behind the shop would have offered nothing at all to gather, its beds resting under frost or snow, every remedy prepared through those coldest months drawn, instead from the careful summer stores dried and jarred months before. You would remember whole winter weeks when the cough and fever remedies barely left the shelves fast enough to keep pace with a parish full of chest complaints, and other weeks, milder ones, when the shop's quiet business slowed to little more than the old widow's aching knees, and the occasional chilblain needing a soothing salve. Summer brought its own different rhythm entirely, the garden at its fullest and most generous, the still working almost daily rather than only occasionally, the whole shop filled from dawn to dusk with the mingled scent of a dozen different herbs drying at once along the beams overhead. The sick, too, changed with the season, fewer coughs and fevers of the deep winter sort, replaced instead by the particular complaints summer always brought with it: insect stings, sunburn on a farm laborer's neck and arms, the occasional stomach upset from food that had turned in the heat before anyone quite noticed. You had come, across your years of training, to think of the whole turning year as its own kind of teacher, each season presenting its own particular lessons that no single day, however carefully lived through, could ever fully substitute for. Autumn, the season the calendar told you the year was currently settled into, carried its own particular character too. The garden's last generous harvest gathered in before the frosts arrived in earnest. Roots dug and dried, the final cuttings of certain herbs, taken at exactly the moment the old teaching held their strength to be at its fullest. You would think of the valerian root you had noted. That very morning in the garden needed digging before autumn's end, and resolve, turning the thought over sleepily now, to see to it properly within the coming week, before the ground grew too hard and cold to work easily. There was, you would reflect, a particular comfort in this seasonal thinking, a reminder that no single day, however full or however demanding, stood entirely alone. Today's careful weighing of the fever remedy for the frightened boy sat within a much longer chain of similar careful weighings, stretching back through your own years of training and forward, presumably through however many years still lay ahead of you in this same trade. Today's compounding of the physician's prescription sat within a similarly long chain of professional collaboration between this shop and the town's medical practice, a relationship that had outlasted several physicians and, you rather suspected, would outlast you too in time, handed down to whichever young apprentice eventually inherited this same counter and this same set of brass weights. You would think, too, settling further into the particular drowsy stillness that always followed a long day's honest labor of your own master, gone now some years, and of how many evenings just like this one he must have spent in this very room, turning over the day's small triumphs and small worries in exactly the way you were turning over your own tonight. The trade you had come to understand slowly across your years in it was not really passed down through any single dramatic moment, not even through the oath itself, weighty as that ceremony had felt at the time. It was passed down through precisely this accumulation of thousands of ordinary evenings, each one adding its own small layer of settled experience, until one day, without any single moment marking the change, a person simply found themselves thinking and working the way their own master once had, the trade's careful patience having settled so completely into their hands and their instincts that it no longer felt like something learned at all, but simply like who they had quietly become. The young apprentice, you knew, was still some years away from that particular kind of settled ease, still consciously working to remember which weight corresponded to which measure, still needing your patient correction on the finer points of grinding and blending. But you had watched her today, weighing the elderflower for the frightened boy's mother, comparing two similar leaves under your patient questioning, and recognized in her small, careful movements the first faint outline of exactly the same quiet competence your own hands now carried without a second thought. 7 years stretched ahead of her still, but the shape of what those years would eventually make of her was already, faintly, visible. The way the shape of a fully grown tree is sometimes faintly visible in a young sapling's first careful branches. You would think, finally, of tomorrow, because a shop like this one never truly stood still even in its quietest hours of rest. The chamomile gathered that morning would need proper drying and storing before it lost its early freshness. A fresh batch of the willow bark preparation. Its stores run rather low. After this evening's generous giving, would need compounding before the week was out. The valerian in the garden wanted digging before the frost. The fence the cooper had promised to mend would need checking on once his own bruised arm had properly healed enough to manage the work. None of it pressed urgently. None of it demanded anything beyond its own patient turn in the shop's long, unhurried rhythm, but all of it waited quietly, the way the whole trade always seemed to wait quietly, patient and steady, and entirely unbothered by any single day's particular demands, ready to be taken up again, calmly and without haste, the moment the shutters opened once more at first light. Sleep, when it finally came that night, would not arrive quite as simply and completely as you might have hoped after such a long day, because the particular nature of this trade meant that even the hours of rest were never entirely, unconditionally your own, and it was somewhere in the deepest, darkest part of the night that a soft, urgent knocking would rouse you from the edge of sleep. You would come down the stair by feel, a single candle cupped carefully against any draught, and find at the door a young husband, breathless from having run most of the way across town, explaining in a low, worried voice that his wife had begun her labor some hours before, and that the local midwife attending her had sent him to fetch a particular preparation, a small measure of raspberry leaf and a little of the shop's careful store of a stronger herb, kept for easing a difficult, prolonged labor, used only sparingly and only under a skilled midwife's direct guidance. You would light the workbench lamp with steady, practiced hands despite the hour, the years of training having built into you a particular kind of readiness that did not depend on how rested or unrested you happened to feel at any given moment, and moved to the shelves without hesitation, gathering exactly what the midwife had requested. This was not a moment for any new judgment of your own, since the trained midwife attending the labor held the clearer view of the case itself. But it was, precisely because of that, a moment demanding exactly the same unhurried precision you brought to every other weighing of the day, perhaps more so, given how much clearly rested on getting the measure exactly right despite the late hour and the young husband's obvious, barely contained anxiety pacing near the door. You would weigh the raspberry leaf first, generous and gentle, and then, with particular care, the stronger herb requested alongside it, checking the small weight twice against the gills, careful teaching on this specific preparation before adding it to the paper packet, because a tired hand working by a single candle in the deep hours of the night was, you had been warned firmly in your training, exactly the kind of hand most vulnerable to the small careless error that steady daylight and full wakefulness would ordinarily have prevented. You would take the extra moment anyway, however anxious the young husband's pacing made the air of the shop feel, because the guild oath sworn with your hand on its worn book had asked for exactly this kind of unwavering care, regardless of the hour, and you had never yet found a good reason to set that promise aside simply because the candle was small and your own bed was calling. You would press the finished packet into his hands, along with the exact instructions the midwife would need, and watch him hurry back out into the dark street, his footsteps already fading toward whatever anxious, hopeful household awaited him. There was no drama in your own part of this small nighttime errand, no sense of crisis in the shop itself, only the same steady, familiar rhythm of weighing and packaging that had filled the entire day just past, performed now by candlelight instead of daylight. For a household you would very likely never learn the full outcome of, trusting, as you always had to trust in moments like this one, that the careful, patient hands of the midwife attending the birth, combined with the careful, patient hands that had prepared this small remedy, would together do everything two trained sets of hands reasonably could. You would bar the door again once he had disappeared into the dark, and stand a moment in the quiet shop, the single lamp still burning low on the workbench, listening to the particular hush of a town fully asleep around you. No cart wheels now, no distant hammer, only the occasional far-off call of the night watchman making his slow rounds through the empty streets, calling out the hour in a low, steady voice that carried a strange, comforting reassurance across the sleeping rooftops. This, too, you had come to understand, was simply part of the trade you had sworn yourself to, this quiet readiness that never entirely switched off, day or night, The understanding that a household in genuine need might knock at any hour and find, waiting behind the door, the same unhurried, careful attention regardless of whether the sun stood high overhead or the whole town lay dark and sleeping around you. You would carry the lamp back up the narrow stair a second time that night, moving quietly past the room where the young apprentice slept soundly, undisturbed by the late knock. Still young enough in the trade that such interruptions had not yet become, as they inevitably would in time, simply another familiar thread in the whole long tapestry of the calling. You would settle back into your own bed, the cold of the sheets already softened somewhat by your earlier warmth, and find, this time, that sleep came more readily, the small errand completed, the shop below settled once more into its watchful darkness, everything in its proper place until the shutters opened again at dawn. Somewhere out beyond your window, the night watchman's call would drift past one final time, before fading into the deeper stillness of the very small hours. And somewhere, too, in a household across the darkened town, a labor would be proceeding through its own long, difficult night, attended now by a small measure of raspberry leaf weighed as carefully at midnight as any remedy had been weighed at noon. You would not know until perhaps the following day, when word inevitably traveled through the small close web of the parish, how that particular night resolved itself, whether the labor eased and a new small life arrived safely into the world, or whether the midwife's skilled hands had needed to call further still on resources beyond what any apothecary's shelf could offer. This uncertainty, too, you had come to accept as simply part of the trade's quiet weight, the knowledge that your own careful work, however faithfully performed, was only ever one thread among several in outcomes that were never, in the end, entirely within any single person's hands to control. The trade asked this of you, you would think, drifting now finally toward proper sleep yourself, a particular kind of quiet faith alongside all its careful, exacting precision. Faith that the accumulated patient wisdom of the Guild's long tradition, faithfully applied by trained and careful hands, gave every household that knocked at your door across a long day and an occasional long night the very best chance the age could offer them, even when the final outcome remained, as it always did in the end, beyond any single apothecary's power to guarantee. There is one more thread of this long day worth pulling gently loose before we let the whole of it settle finally into rest, and it concerns not any single patient or any single remedy, but the quiet, remarkable distances some of the shop's own stock had traveled before ever reaching your careful hands at all. You would think of this sometimes in idle moments, turning a small lump of frankincense resin between your fingers, or breaking a stick of cinnamon bark for weighing, and wondering, the way any curious mind eventually wonders about the objects that pass daily through its hands, exactly how such things came to be sitting on a shelf in a modest market town shop at all. The frankincense, you knew from your own training and from the occasional traveler's tale, exchanged with merchants like the one you had visited that very afternoon, came from trees that grew nowhere near the shores of your own country, hardy, resinous trees native to the dry sun, scorched hills of Arabia and the Horn of Africa, tapped for their fragrant sap much as a woodsman might tap a maple tree. The collected resin dried slowly in the desert air before ever beginning its long journey northward. That journey, when you traced it in your own mind, ran across an almost dizzying chain of hands and routes, camel caravans, crossing vast stretches of desert to reach the trading ports of the Arabian coast, ships carrying the precious cargo onward across the warm waters toward Egypt or the eastern Mediterranean, and from there, by a further tangled combination of sea routes and overland caravans through Italy and across the mountain passes into the heart of Europe, until at last, many months and countless hands after it had first been carefully scored from a living tree, a merchant much like the one you had haggled with that afternoon carried a small portion of it into your own quiet market town and sold it at a price that reflected every single mile of that improbable distance into your own careful keeping. The cinnamon carried its own similarly long story, grown on trees native to distant lands, whose exact location remained, even to educated men like the physician you had served that afternoon, more legend and rumor than firm geography. The bark harvested and dried, and carried by ship and caravan across an equally vast network of trade that had existed, in one form or another, for many centuries before your own birth, and would very likely continue for many centuries after. The pepper, too, and the ginger, and the true saffron, most costly of all by weight, each one representing not merely a pleasant flavor or a useful remedy, but an entire invisible web of distant lands, distant peoples, and distant labor that most of your own customers, reaching for a small pinch of the finished spice across your counter, never paused to consider at all. You had come to feel, across your years in the trade, a particular quiet respect for this invisible web, a sense that your own small shop, however modest and however rooted in this one particular market town, was in truth connected by these careful supply chains to a far wider world than most people in the parish ever gave much thought to in the ordinary business of their days. The shop's own humble garden, tended so carefully just beyond the back door, supplied the gentle, everyday remedies that belonged to everyone regardless of means. But the shop's higher shelves, stocked with these costlier traveled goods, connected the parish, in their own quiet way, to deserts and mountain ranges and distant seas that most of your customers would never see with their own eyes in the whole course of their lives. And there was something in that thought, turned over slowly on a quiet evening, that always left you with a particular settled wonder at the sheer, patient scale of the trade you had sworn yourself to. You would think, too, of the guild's own careful rules around these costlier goods. Rules built not merely around their expense, but around the genuine risk of adulteration that traveled alongside anything valuable enough to tempt a dishonest hand somewhere along its long journey. True saffron, stretched with cheaper, similarly colored substitutes by an unscrupulous trader 3 towns back along the road. Resin cut with a cheaper, less potent substance to stretch a merchant's profit at the expense of the final buyer's trust. The guild's insistence that every apothecary learn to judge such goods carefully by sight, by scent, by the particular telltale signs of genuine quality, existed precisely because the trade's long invisible chain of distant hands offered, at every single link, some small opportunity for dishonesty to creep in unnoticed, and the final, careful check, the one that mattered most directly to the health of the parish, always fell to you, standing at your own counter with your own trained fingers and your own trained nose, the last careful gatekeeper before any of it reached a customer's actual hands. This, you would think, settling the small piece of frankincense back onto its shelf, was perhaps one further quiet dimension of the seriousness the old apothecary carried. Not merely the careful weighing of grains and scruples, not merely the careful grinding at the mortar, but this wider vigilance too, the patient, practiced judgment that stood as the parish's final safeguard against every possible failure, however distant its true origin, in the long chain of hands that had carried a given remedy from some far corner of the known world into your own small, quiet shop. It was a heavier responsibility, in its way, than most people passing your counter each day ever paused to consider, and yet you had come, across your years of training, to carry it without any real sense of burden at all, simply as one more thread, patient and steady, woven into the whole unhurried fabric of the calling you had sworn yourself to on the day of your oath. Let us slow down further still now, and rest for a while in the quiet hours just before true sleep finally takes hold. Turning back over the whole shape of the day you have just lived through, the way a tired mind naturally does in the last soft minutes before it lets go entirely, you would think first of the oath, so many years behind you now and yet still, somehow, present in every single motion of every single day, the guild's worn book beneath your hand, the promise to weigh true, to sell no herb you did not know by name and by nature, to turn away no honest custom of the poor. You would think of how strange it had once seemed, as a young apprentice hearing those words for the first time, that a trade built around small dried plants and a set of brass weights could carry such weight of its own, and how entirely unstrange it felt now, after so many years of living inside that promise every single day, each small careful weighing simply one more quiet renewal of a vow made once, long ago, and kept faithfully, unremarkably, ever since. You would think of the shop itself waking around you before dawn, the fire coaxed patiently back to life, the shutters lifted to let in the first grey light, the slow, familiar walk past, every shelf checking for damp or disorder, the particular smell of dried thyme and beeswax that had become, across so many mornings, simply the smell of your own life, rather than anything you still consciously noticed as remarkable. You would think of the garden beyond the back door, damp with dew in the early light, the chamomile gathered before the sun could draw away its gentle strength, the mint always threatening to overrun its neighbors, the valerian waiting patiently for its own proper season of digging. You would think of the balance, and of how strange the whole intricate system of grains and scruples and drams had once seemed to a child of 12, just beginning an apprenticeship, and how entirely natural it felt now, your hands reaching without thought for exactly the correct small weight the moment a quantity was named. You would think of the old cooper's bruised arm, bound carefully in its comfrey poultice, and of the particular quiet satisfaction that came not from any dramatic cure, but from the plain, steady comfort of a clear diagnosis calmly delivered. You would think of the mortar and pestle, the steady rhythm of grinding that had filled so many thousands of hours across your years in this trade, thud against stone, thud against stone. 3 separate herbs worked patiently together into something new. You would think of the young apprentice at your elbow, still learning to name a leaf correctly, still learning the particular unhurried patience the whole trade demanded of anyone who wished to practice it properly. and of how completely you recognized, in her small, careful hands, the same uncertain beginnings your own hands had once carried. You would think of the spice merchant's cart in the crowded square, the cinnamon and pepper and costly saffron that had traveled such an improbable distance to reach your own small counter, and of the whole invisible web of distant lands and distant hands that connected your quiet market town to deserts and mountains most of your neighbors would never see. You would think, longest of all perhaps, of the frightened young mother and her feverish son, and of the particular careful discipline it had taken to slow down, weigh exactly, and speak calmly, even with her anxious eyes fixed so hopefully on your hands. You would think of the laborer's wife with her basket of eggs, the barefoot boy sent running for willow bark, the old widow's aching knees, each one a small thread in the shop's own quiet, unwritten accounting of care given freely wherever it was genuinely needed, regardless of what coin, if any, could be offered in return. You would think of the physician's careful prescription, faithfully compounded, and of the old midwife's unhurried visit at day's end, and of the young husband's breathless knock in the deepest hour of the night, the raspberry leaf weighed as carefully by a single candle as anything had been weighed in the full light of noon. And you would think, finally, of the ledger closed, the poison cupboard locked, the fire banked low, the shop settling into its own patient darkness below you, waiting, as it always waited, for the next long, unhurried day to begin. There was no single dramatic moment in any of it. You would reflect, drifting now properly towards sleep at last. No single triumph or single crisis that the whole day could be said to hinge upon. There was only this, hour after hour, weighing after weighing, small kindness after small kindness, the patient, careful accumulation of a life lived entirely at the pace the work itself demanded, never faster, never careless, built one grain and one scruple at a time into something that had, across so many years now, become simply who you were. This, in the end, is perhaps the truest answer to the small question we began with tonight. Whether you could have lasted a single day in a medieval apothecary's shop. The honest answer, you would find, is not really about strength or cleverness at all, but about patience, the particular, unglamorous patience to slow down precisely when everything around you urges haste, to check a weight twice when once might seem sufficient, to speak calmly to a frightened parent, to grind a compound with exactly the same careful rhythm on the 1000th occasion as on the first. It is a patience built slowly, over 7 long years, and then over many more years beyond that, one ordinary day laid quietly upon another, until it no longer feels like discipline at all, but simply like breathing. Before we let the whole of this long day rest entirely, it is worth pausing a moment longer on one small object that has sat quietly on the shop's workbench through every single hour we have spent there tonight without ever once being properly introduced. The shop's own worn recipe book and the particular kind of inheritance it represents. You would take it down now, in this last quiet hour before sleep, more from old habit than any real necessity, and turn its heavy leather cover open under the lamp's soft light, the way you often did at the close of a long day, not to look up anything in particular, but simply for the quiet pleasure of handling something so thoroughly steeped in the accumulated care of everyone who had worked at this counter before you. The earliest pages brittle now and carefully mended in places with fine stitching, carried a hand you recognized as belonging to your master's own master, a man you had never met, but whose careful, slightly old-fashioned formulas still governed a good portion of the shop's most reliable remedies. Beneath his entries, in a slightly different hand, your own master had added his own corrections and refinements across his many years at this same counter, small marginal notes adjusting a proportion here, suggesting a gentler substitute there. The whole page a quiet conversation between two careful minds, separated by decades but joined permanently in the same patient pursuit of getting each remedy exactly right. Your own hand had begun appearing in the more recent pages some years back now, tentative at first, in your earliest years of independent practice, growing steadily more confident with each passing season. And you would find, turning slowly through the book's later pages, your own small marginal addition sitting now beside your master's, the beginning of exactly the same quiet conversation across generations that the book's whole worn length represented. You would think, turning a page, of how strange and how comforting it was to realize that this same slow, layered accumulation would very likely continue long after your own hand had stopped adding to it. The young apprentice sleeping soundly upstairs destined, if all went well across her own coming years of training, to add her own careful notes to these same pages in turn, her handwriting settling in beside yours the way yours had settled in beside your master's before her. The book held more than mere formulas you had come to appreciate over the years, more than a simple list of ingredients and proportions copied down for easy reference. Scattered through its pages, in the margins and occasionally on pages set aside entirely for the purpose, were small notes of a different character altogether, brief accounts of particular cases that had taught some memorable lesson, a reminder to be especially cautious with a certain preparation during the hottest months of summer, when its properties seemed to shift somewhat, a note about a particular household's specific sensitivity to a common remedy that had taken an uncomfortable, though not dangerous, reaction to discover. This was knowledge that no formal guild teaching could fully capture, the accumulated, hard-won wisdom of many individual careful observers across many individual years, preserved not through any official channel, but simply through the quiet, private habit of writing things down when they seemed worth remembering. You would find, turning to a particular well-worn page near the book's middle, the formula for the very chest remedy you had ground fresh that morning, mullein and licorice and hyssop, and beside it, in your master's own careful hand, a small note recording an adjustment he had made some 15 years before, reducing the hyssop slightly after noticing it seemed to sit poorly with the very youngest patients, a small, hard-won piece of practical wisdom that had quietly improved the remedy for every single child who had received it in all the years since, most of whom, and their own mothers too, would never know that such a careful, considered refinement had ever taken place at all. This, you would think, was perhaps the truest, quietest gift the trade offered its practitioners, not glory, not any particular fame beyond the narrow bounds of your own parish, but this slow, patient improvement of small, genuinely useful things, carried forward faithfully from one careful pair of hands to the next. You would close the book gently and return it to its shelf, the lamp's flame guttering now, low on its remaining oil, and think, one final time before sleep finally claimed you properly, of the whole long chain the book represented, stretching back through your master and his master before him and forward, presumably through the young apprentice sleeping soundly above, and whoever, in turn, she would eventually teach at this same counter in her own turn. The individual days blurred together. After enough years in the trade, you had come to notice one long careful morning much like another, one afternoon's compounding folding almost seamlessly into the next. But the book remembered what any single memory, however careful, inevitably let slip, and there was a particular, settled comfort in knowing that whatever small refinements your own years at this counter eventually contributed, some quiet correction to a formula, some small note about a case that had taught you something worth remembering, would likely outlast your own working years by a very great margin indeed, folded quietly into the same patient, accumulating record that had already outlasted so many careful hands before your own. The lamp's flame would gutter once more, and you would reach to extinguish it fully now. The very last small task of this very long day, watching the small flame shrink and finally vanish, leaving the workbench, the shelves, the whole quiet shop below in the complete, settled darkness of a night now fully arrived. You would sit a moment longer in that darkness anyway, not from any particular need, simply because the stillness of a shop finally, fully closed for the night, carried its own particular quality worth, sitting with a while before finally climbing the stair to your own waiting bed, the accumulated weight of a long, careful day settling at last into something closer to rest. There is one further quiet thread worth following before we finally let the whole of this long day close, and it concerns the bells themselves, the ones that had marked, all through the hours we have spent together tonight, the slow, steady passage of the day without you perhaps ever fully noticing how much they shaped the shape of your own working hours. You would think of this now, in the last settled minutes before sleep, the way the monastery bells across the far side of town had rung out, faithfully, at each of the day's canonical hours, matins in the deep dark, before you had even risen, prime as the shutters were first lifted, terse somewhere in the midst of the morning's careful weighing, sext at noon as you crossed the square toward the spice merchant's cart, none through the quiet stretch of early afternoon, vespers as the light began its long golden decline toward evening, and compline, finally, somewhere in the hour you had spent closing the ledger and locking the poison cupboard, the whole rhythm of prayer running alongside, and beneath the whole rhythm of the shop's own daily labor so constantly and so completely that you had long since stopped consciously noticing the connection between the two. The monastery itself, its own herb garden considerably larger and more varied than the shop's modest plot behind the back door, occupied its own quiet, particular place in the wider medical life of the parish, the monks and the occasional learned sister, among the nearby convent's own small community, maintaining a tradition of herbal knowledge that stretched back, through careful copied manuscripts, to learning far older than even the guild's own written rolls, learning drawn from monasteries across the continent and, further back still, from the physicians of the ancient world, whose careful observations the monastic copyists had preserved faithfully across centuries, when so much else of that older learning had been lost or scattered. You had visited the monastery's own infirmary on occasion, exchanging cuttings from a particularly good strain of a certain herb, or seeking his opinion on a difficult case that seemed to fall somewhere between your own trade and the deeper theological and philosophical questions the monastery's own scholars sometimes debated about the causes of illness and suffering. There was no real rivalry between your two quiet institutions you had come to understand across your years of practice, though a visitor unfamiliar with the parish's particular arrangements might have expected one, given how much their two spheres of knowledge overlapped. The monastery tended primarily to its own community and to the poorest and most desperate cases that arrived at its gate seeking charity, while your own shop served the wider working life of the town itself. And the two institutions had settled, across many years of quiet coexistence, into a comfortable, mutually respectful division of labor, each drawing occasionally on the other's particular strengths when a case demanded it. The infirmary had sent a particularly difficult skin complaint your way just the previous month, a case beyond what his own more limited stock of purchased goods could properly address, and you, in turn, had sent a desperately poor family to the monastery's gate more than once across the years, when their circumstances called for a kind of sustained charitable care. Your own shop, however generous its own quiet accounting of goods given freely, simply could not extend indefinitely on its own. You would think, too, of the particular comfort the bells themselves offered, quite apart from their more practical function of marking the working hours, a comfort that had settled into you so completely across your years in this trade that you no longer consciously registered it as comfort at all, simply as the natural, expected texture of an ordinary day. In a world without clocks in any home but the very wealthiest, the bells offered every single person in the parish, rich or poor, educated or entirely unlettered, a shared, common structure to their day, a way of knowing, without any private possession at all, exactly how the hours were passing and exactly how much of the working day still lay ahead. You had come to feel, across enough years of hearing them ring out faithfully through every kind of day, storm and clear sky alike, market day and quiet day alike, that the bells represented something close to the same patient, steady reliability the guild itself asked of every apothecary sworn into its ranks, a promise kept faithfully, without exception, regardless of how difficult or how easy any particular day happened to be. The final bell of compline, rung some while before you had finally extinguished the workbench lamp, would still be settling in your memory now, as sleep drew properly close at last, its familiar low tone folding itself quietly into the whole accumulated texture of the day just finished, one more thread among the many we have followed together tonight. The guild oath and the balance and the mortar, the frightened mother and the labourer's wife with her basket of eggs, the physician's careful prescription and the old midwife's unhurried visit, the recipe book's many careful hands, and now, finally, the bells themselves marking, as they had marked every single day of your working life so far, and would very likely go on marking for many years yet to come, the whole patient, unhurried shape of a calling built entirely around slow, careful attention, faithfully given, hour after hour, day after day. Let us step back now, gently, from the particular day we have spent inside, and ask, in these last quiet minutes together, what any of it might mean to a person listening from so many centuries further along. Tucked into a bed, the old apothecary could never have imagined, in a world so changed that the guild itself, along with nearly everything it once governed, has long since faded into little more than old records and older stories. By today's standards, you would find so much of what filled that long medieval day would seem impossibly slow, impossibly inefficient. An entire morning's careful weighing accomplished now, in the time it takes a modern pharmacy to print a single label, an entire year's worth of guild training compressed, in the modern world, into qualifications measured in months rather than years. A modern visitor, set down without warning in that quiet shop, might find themselves faintly astonished at how much of the day's careful labor, the grinding, the distilling, the endless checking and rechecking, could now be accomplished by machines in a fraction of the time, and might wonder, not unreasonably, whether all that slow, patient care had been, in some sense, simply a product of the age's limitations, rather than any genuine virtue worth remembering. And yet there is something in the old apothecary's particular unhurried attentiveness that feels, even now, worth pausing over rather than simply dismissing as the quaint inefficiency of a vanished world. The patience that let a person weigh a remedy exactly right, rather than merely approximately right. The willingness to slow down precisely at the moment when haste seemed most tempting, with a frightened parent's eyes fixed hopefully on your hands. The quiet, unspoken commitment, older than any single guild's written rolls, to turn away no honest need simply because a purse happened to be thin that week. None of these qualities depended, in the end, on the particular slowness of a world without modern machinery. They depended on something else entirely, a kind of settled, deliberate care that any age, however fast or however slow its tools happen to run, can either choose to cultivate or choose to let slip away. You would think, perhaps, of how much of your own life, whatever century you happen to be listening from tonight, still occasionally asks something similar of you, some small daily task that rewards exactly this kind of patient, unhurried attention rather than speed, some small moment where slowing down, checking twice, resisting the pull toward haste, quietly serves you and the people around you far better than rushing ever could. The old apothecary's particular trade has vanished now, its careful brass weights and its worn recipe books mostly resting today in museum cases, rather than active workbenches, but the deeper posture underneath that trade, patient, careful, unhurried, respectful of small things that matter more than they first appear to, remains available to anyone willing to slow down long enough to practice it, in whatever form their own particular life happens to ask it of them. There is a kind of quiet dignity, too, worth sitting with a while longer, in a life built so entirely around service to others, around the frightened mother and the laborer with his aching arm and the barefoot boy sent running in the dark for a remedy his family could not pay for. The old apothecary was not, by the standards of his own age or any age since, a person of great wealth or great renown, and the shop that occupied so much of a single long day rarely appears in any grander history of the period, the ones concerned with kings and wars and the great sweeping movements of nations, but within the narrow, particular bounds of one small market town, across one long, careful day repeated, with small variations, across an entire working lifetime, that quiet shop, and the patient hands that kept it mattered enormously to a great many ordinary people who had nowhere else, in a world without hospitals or trained physicians easily within reach, to turn for the careful, competent help that eased their suffering and steadied their fear. Perhaps that, in the end, is the quiet gift a day like this one, walked through slowly and without hurry, offers a listener so many centuries removed from it. Not nostalgia exactly, and not any simple claim that the old ways were somehow better than the ways we have now, since so much of what medicine can offer today would have seemed, to the old apothecary standing at that same counter, nothing short of miraculous, but a reminder, gentle and unforced, of how much genuine good a patient, careful, unhurried life can do, one small weighing and one small kindness at a time, however modest and however unremarked by any wider history it happens to remain. The shop's fire is fully out now, the last of its light long since gone from beneath the ash. The shutters are barred. The ledger rests closed on its shelf, its accounts balanced true for one more day. Somewhere above, in the small warm room we first met you, in the days-long patient labor has finally, fully given way to rest, and the whole quiet town around that little shop has settled, the way it settles every single night, into its own deep, unhurried dark. Before we let the whole of this long day rest completely, there is one final memory worth lingering over a while longer, older than any of the ones we have followed so far tonight. And it concerns the particular examination the guild had required of you before it would ever allow you to swear the oath at all. You would remember, drifting now in that soft space, just before proper sleep, the morning of your own practical examination some years back, held not in the guild hall itself, but in the very shop where you had trained, 3 senior apothecaries arriving early to watch you work through a series of careful tasks, under their close, silent observation. There had been nothing especially dramatic about the morning itself, no raised voices, no theatrical drama of the kind a storyteller might invent for such an occasion, only the particular, weighted quiet of 3 experienced practitioners, watching every single motion of your hands, with the close attention of people whose own good name, in some measure, depended on judging correctly whether you were truly ready. The first task had been simple in its instructions and demanding in its execution, a row of 12 dried simples laid out on the counter, unlabeled, and you asked to name each one correctly by sight and by scent alone, then to explain, for each, what it could easily be mistaken for by a careless or poorly trained hand. You would remember the particular quality of silence in the room, while you worked through them one at a time, lifting each to the light, rubbing a small portion between finger and thumb, naming it aloud along with its most dangerous look-alike, the 3 examiners saying nothing at all, simply making small marks in a ledger of their own as you spoke. The second task had tested your hands rather than your memory, a series of weighings performed under close watch, a quantity named aloud by the senior examiner, and you required to select the correct weights and measure out the amount exactly, the beam's stillness the only proof needed that you had gotten it right. You would remember your hands trembling faintly on the very first weighing, more from the weight of being watched than from any real uncertainty about the task itself, and steadying, gradually, as the familiar rhythm of the work reasserted itself, despite the unusual pressure of the occasion, the years of ordinary practice carrying you through in the end far more reliably than any nervous effort at extra carefulness could have. The third and final task had been the one every apprentice in the Guild dreaded most in the retelling, though it had felt, in the actual doing of it, rather less frightening than its reputation suggested. A mock case presented by the senior examiner, a fictional patient with a described set of symptoms, and you required to walk through aloud exactly how you would assess the case, what remedy you would propose, at what dose, and why, defending your reasoning against the examiner's careful, probing questions. You would remember choosing your words slowly and deliberately, resisting the urge to rush toward an answer simply to fill the silence, because you had watched enough real patients over your years of training to know that the correct pace for this kind of thinking was slow, careful, and entirely unhurried, regardless of how much a watching examiner's silence seemed to invite a faster response. You had passed in the end, as most well-trained apprentices eventually did, though not without the examiner's noting, gently but plainly, one or two small points where your reasoning could have been sharper, a note you had carried with you afterward, not as a wound to your pride, but as one further small correction added to the long, patient accumulation of lessons that had shaped your hands and your judgment across the whole of your training. The Guild did not expect perfection from any single examination. You had come to understand. Only a demonstrated, reliable competence, built from years of unhurried practice, sufficient to be trusted with the genuine, ongoing welfare of a whole parish's worth of ordinary households. There is a particular, settled comfort in remembering that examination now, so many years past, on an evening when the day's own work has closed properly and well, every weighing accurate, every remedy compounded with care, every patient met with the same unhurried attention the Guild had once tested so carefully in that quiet, watched morning. The examination itself had ended, but the standard it represented never truly had, renewed instead, quietly and without any further formal testing, in every single weighing performed at this same counter across every day since. The Guild's trust in your hands proven not by any single dramatic moment, but by this long, unremarkable, faithfully repeated pattern of careful, ordinary competence. You would think, one final time, before sleep properly claimed you, of the young apprentice sleeping soundly in the room beside your own, and of the examination that waited somewhere ahead of her, still some years distant but drawing nearer, season by season, exactly the way your own once had. You had no doubt, watching her small, careful hands at the mortar that very afternoon, that she would meet it, when the day finally came, with exactly the same steady, unhurried competence the Guild had once tested in you, built the same slow, patient way, one ordinary careful day laid quietly upon another, until the trade's whole demanding standard had settled, as it always eventually settled in a properly trained apprentice, into something that no longer felt like a test to be passed at all, but simply, quietly, like who she had become. There is one further corner of the shop we have not yet properly lingered over tonight, tucked behind that same locked iron grate at the back of the room, and it deserves, before we finally let the whole day close, a slow and careful visit of its own, the same unhurried curiosity you would bring to anything else worth understanding properly. You would think of the small collection of plants kept there, apart from the rest of the shop's ordinary stock, not because they were somehow evil or forbidden in any simple sense, but because their proper use demanded a precision and a caution beyond what the shop's more everyday remedies required. Foxglove, its tall spires of speckled purple flowers, a common enough sight in the hedgerows and woodland edges beyond the town, and yet its leaves, dried and carefully prepared in exact and modest quantity, capable of steadying a laboring heart in ways the old herbalists had learned to recognize and respect across many careful generations, while the same leaves, handled carelessly or measured too generously, could do the opposite entirely. You would handle the small store of foxglove, kept behind the great only rarely, and always with the same unhurried, doubled care you gave every weighing, checking and rechecking before ever adding a single leaf to any preparation. Mandrake root, too, sat in its own careful place, a plant wrapped already in centuries of folklore and superstition by the time it reached your own shop, its curious forked root sometimes fancifully likened, in older tales, to a small human figure, though you had long since learned to set aside such colorful stories in favor of the plant's actual, carefully documented properties. A strong and sometimes dangerous preparation used sparingly for easing severe pain when gentler remedies had proven insufficient. You would remember your own master explaining, patiently, that the old superstitious tales surrounding certain plants like this one often grew up precisely because people sensed, correctly, that the plant held real power and had simply reached, in the absence of the guild's more careful, measured understanding, for stories and legends to explain a potency they could feel but not yet properly account for. Henbane, with its pale, veined flowers and its own long history in the careful hands of trained practitioners, and the poppy, its dark, heavy seed heads a familiar enough sight in certain gardens grown specifically for this careful purpose. Each occupied its own particular place on the locked shelf. Each understood, through generations of patient guild accumulated knowledge, in terms of exactly how much could ease genuine suffering, and exactly where that same help shaded, past a certain careful line, into genuine harm. You would think of how much collective careful observation, across how many careful generations of apothecaries before you, had gone into establishing exactly where those lines properly sat, generation after generation of trained hands noting, recording and passing forward the hard-won knowledge of safe and careful use, so that you yourself, standing at this same counter, inherited not a dangerous unknown, but a carefully mapped and thoroughly understood set of tools, respected rather than feared. This was, in the end, perhaps the deepest lesson the locked grate itself represented, more than any single plant kept behind it. The guild's whole careful philosophy distilled into a single small piece of ironwork, that genuine power, properly understood and properly respected, could be safely and usefully held, provided the hands holding it had been trained with exactly the patience and exactly the seriousness the guild's long apprenticeship demanded. You did not fear the plants kept behind that grate, not after so many years of careful training, but you did not take them lightly either, and it was precisely that steady middle ground, respect without dread, caution without paralysis, that the whole of your 7 years of training had been so patiently, so carefully built to establish in your own 2 hands. You would glance once more, in memory now rather than in fact, toward that quiet locked corner of the darkened shop below, satisfied, as you always were at the close of a properly finished day, that everything behind it remained exactly where the written record said it should, and let that small, settled certainty join the whole long accumulation of the day's other small certainties, the ledger balanced, the fire banked, the shutters barred, as you finally, fully let yourself rest. There is one last quiet thread of the trade worth following before we finally let sleep take you properly, and it concerns not any single day's work, but the wider fellowship of the guild itself, stretched out across the whole region, beyond the narrow bounds of your own particular market town. You would think of the apothecaries in the neighboring towns, some known to you personally through the guild's occasional regional gatherings, others known only by reputation and the careful, formal letters exchanged whenever some particular need arose, and of the quiet, steady understanding that ran between all of you, a shared trade bound together by the same oath, the same careful standards, the same patient training, regardless of which particular market square any individual shop happened to occupy. You would remember some winters back, a spell of unusually severe illness moving through your own parish that had drawn hard on the shop's store of a particular costly remedy faster than the usual trade routes could readily replenish it, and of the letter you had sent, in careful formal hand, to a fellow apothecary 2 towns distant, asking whether his own stores might spare a portion until your next supply arrived, and of the generous, unhesitating reply that had come back within the week, a modest parcel of exactly what you needed, sent without any expectation beyond the same courtesy returned should his own shop ever find itself in similar need. This kind of quiet mutual aid, you had come to understand, ran beneath the more visible structure of the guild's formal rules the way an underground stream runs beneath a visible river, rarely spoken of directly, never written into any single formal ordinance, and yet entirely real and entirely relied upon whenever genuine need arose. A trade built so centrally around the welfare of ordinary people could not, in the end, function properly if its individual practitioners treated one another as mere rivals competing narrowly for the same custom, and the guild's own culture, cultivated patiently across generations, had settled instead into something closer to a wide, loosely connected fellowship, competitive in the ordinary small ways any neighboring tradespeople might be, but bound together when it truly mattered, by a shared understanding that the whole region's welfare depended on every individual shop remaining properly stocked and properly capable, regardless of whose particular counter a given remedy happened to be dispensed across. You would think, too, of the guild's occasional larger gatherings, held perhaps twice in a given year, drawing apothecaries from across a wide stretch of the surrounding countryside into a single town for a few days of shared business, examination of new apprentices, discussion of any troubling cases or new remedies worth wider attention, and no small measure of simple, welcome fellowship among people who understood, better than almost anyone else in their respective towns, the particular quiet weight the calling carried. You would remember the warmth of those gatherings, the easy exchange of hard-won, practical knowledge between practitioners who had each spent years refining their own particular understanding of the trade, a newer preparation one colleague had found effective for a stubborn complaint, a caution another had learned the hard way about a particular supplier's unreliable goods. All of it shared freely and gathered gratefully, because the guild's whole culture held, quietly but firmly, that hoarding useful knowledge served no one. Least of all the ordinary households, every single one of you had sworn, on your own particular day of oath-taking, to serve faithfully and well. This wider fellowship, you would think, drifting now properly toward sleep at last, was itself a kind of quiet answer to the small question this whole evening had gently turned over, whether a single person could truly have lasted, entirely alone, in a calling that asked so much careful, patient attention every single day. The honest answer, you would realize, was that no apothecary ever truly stood entirely alone at all, however solitary the long hours at your own particular counter sometimes felt. Behind every single day's careful work stood the guild's whole accumulated tradition, the master who had trained you, the examiners who had tested you, the neighboring apothecaries who would send aid without hesitation should genuine need arise, the monastery's own quiet infirmary just across town, the physician whose careful prescriptions you faithfully compounded, and the whole long chain of careful hands, stretching back through the recipe book's earliest brittle pages and forward, presumably, through however many careful hands would eventually follow your own. The single long day we have spent together tonight was never, in truth, quite as solitary as it may have felt in any single quiet hour of it, but rather one small, faithful link in something very much larger and very much older than any single apothecary, however skilled, could ever hope to be entirely on their own. Sleep, when it came properly at last, would not arrive as any single sudden moment, but rather as a slow, gradual softening, the way it so often does after a day spent so entirely and so patiently occupied. You would feel the last small threads of the day's careful attention loosening one by one, the mental tally of weights and measures fading first, then the faces of the day's various patients, the cooper and the feverish boy and the labourer's wife, drifting further and further from any sharp, present focus and settling instead into something gentler, more distant, the soft blur any day takes on in the last minutes before proper rest. You might, in that soft drifting space, imagine tomorrow waiting patiently beyond the windows dark, another shop to open, another set of shutters to lift, another basket of dew-damp herbs to gather from the small garden before the sun properly climbed. But tomorrow, you would find, no longer pressed at you with any real urgency in this particular quiet hour, content instead to simply wait its own patient turn, exactly the way every other task of this long, careful trade had always learned to wait its turn, weighed and measured and attended to in its own proper time, never rushed, never neglected, simply met, hour after hour, with the same unhurried, steady attention that had carried you safely and faithfully through this entire long day. The candle by your bed, if you had troubled to light one at all in these final minutes, would have burned low by now, its small flame no longer really needed, the room settling into the same complete, restful darkness that had already claimed the shop below, the garden beyond the back door, and the whole quiet, sleeping town stretched out around you under a sky slowly turning, unseen, toward whatever hour of the deep night had by now properly arrived. There is nothing left to weigh. There is nothing left to grind. There is only this soft, settling darkness, patient and complete, waiting to carry you, exactly as it has carried every apothecary who ever closed a shop properly, and well at the end of a long, faithful day, gently through until morning. We have walked together, this whole quiet while, through a single long day in a medieval apothecary's shop, from the cold hour before dawn when you first woke to remember the geld's oath, through the opening of the shutters and the tending of the small Physic garden, the careful weighing at the balance and the steady grinding at the mortar, out into the crowded market at midday, and back again to the sick and the poor waiting at your door, the frightened mother with her feverish son, the labourer's wife with her basket of eggs, the physician's careful prescription, the old midwife's gentle visit, and at last to the ledger closed and the poison cupboard locked and the fire banked low for the night. If your own eyes have grown heavy somewhere along that long, unhurried walk, that is exactly as it should be. There is nothing left to weigh tonight, nothing left to grind, nothing waiting at your own door that cannot wait quite comfortably until morning. Let the shop settle into its own patient darkness, the way it has settled every night for longer than anyone in that quiet market town could properly remember, and let yourself settle in exactly the same way, the whole slow weight of the day finally, fully set down. You do not need to remember any of it in the morning, the grains and the scruples, the guild's careful rules, the particular order of the day's small tasks. None of it is a test, and there is nothing here that asks anything more of you now than the simple, gentle act of letting your breathing slow, and your shoulders soften a little further into wherever you happen to be resting, and your mind drift, if it wants to, back toward that small candlelit shop, the dried herbs hanging quiet from the beams, the mortar clean on its shelf, the last lamp finally extinguished. Sleep well. The apothecary will be back again soon, with another quiet chapter, another slow candlelit hour to spend together. Until then, may your own night be as settled and as gently kept as the little shop we leave now behind us, its shutters barred, its fire low, its long, patient rest just beginning. Good night.